Hey guys, tonight we take a quiet step back into the marble-clad chaos of ancient Rome, a place where sandals slap against sun-baked stone, where senators argue over wine, and where the air always smells faintly of olive oil incense and someone else's misfortune. You're not some emperor or gladiator. No, you're a middling citizen, someone who scrapes by, keeps your tunic clean, and tries very hard not to get noticed by the wrong magistrate. And that's good. Because Rome wasn't just a city of civilization, it was a city of rules. Thousands of them. Cross one, and you might find yourself tossed into a river in a sack, with a monkey, or worse. Tonight, we're not diving into grand wars or imperial scandals. We're drifting gently and curiously through the lesser-known side of Roman law, its punishments, the strange ones, the oddly specific ones, the ones that make you wonder, who came up with this and why were they so committed? You probably won't survive this, but you will learn how to avoid a public lashing, why being forgotten might be worse than death, and just how terrifying a courtroom mime can be. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're watching from, what country, what time. I'm always amazed by the cozy little corners you guys listen from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake to the sound of shouting. That's not unusual here. Rome wakes early, and she wakes loudly. But today, the voices carry that peculiar edge curiosity, sharpened by something sinister. You shuffle to the street and blend into the gathering crowd. A platform has been erected. A man stands in chains. No one tells you what he did, but you guess it was serious. Rome has its ways. The 12 tables may be the bones of Roman law, but interpretation is everything, and enforcement even more so. Depending on your status, wealth, and connections, your punishment could be a public slap on the wrist, or a slow, messy descent into obscurity or agony. And Roman society loves a show. Justice isn't just done, it's seen, smelled, shouted, and sometimes served with roasted chestnuts. Historians still argue whether Roman punishments were meant more for deterrence or drama. What's clear is that the spectacle of punishment was deeply embedded in daily life. From slaves to senators, no one was fully safe from Rome's elaborate, often theatrical system of consequences. The laws themselves were a mixture of borrowed Greek philosophy, hard-nosed practicality, and pure Roman flair. Theft might earn you lashes. Adultery could cost you your nose. And if you killed your father, well, we'll get there. You remember once watching a man branded on the forehead for lying in court. He screamed only once. After that, he just cried silently. That scar would outlast his reputation and his business. Punishment wasn't always about pain. Sometimes it was about reputation. A Roman could survive a whipping, but never recover from public shame. Legal scholars today still debate how effective that kind of deterrence really was. But the ancient sources are clear. Shame could ruin you faster than any sword. As the man on the platform is led away, his sentence delayed, or perhaps already complete, you find yourself oddly unsettled, not by the punishment itself, but by how normal it all feels, how routine, how Roman. You've just sat down for your midday bread when the neighbor's boy rushes past, yelling something about the sack. Everyone knows what that means. You follow the flow of curious feet toward the Tiber, toward justice, or at least Rome's soggiest version of it. The punishment is called poena culae, and it's as specific as it is unnerving. You don't see it often, thankfully, because it's reserved for only one crime parricide, the murder of a parent. That crime, to a Roman, is an unforgivable disruption of the natural order. It's not just betrayal, it's cosmic offense. So, Rome answers with something theatrical and symbolic. First, the convicted is whipped, then dressed in a coarse tunic, then sewn into a large leather sack. But not alone. Oh no, they add, friends. A monkey, a rooster, a viper, a dog. Not to cuddle, not even as poetic justice. The exact reasoning is lost to time, but many scholars believe it was meant to represent nature itself rejecting the criminal. Historians still argue whether the animals were chosen for symbolic reasons or just for maximum chaos inside the sack. One medieval chronicler insisted the rooster was included to mark dawn of the condemned's rebirth through death. Others suspect it was simpler snakes bite monkeys, claw dogs, thrash, and roosters peck. It's a storm of punishment inside a leather tomb. Once sewn up, the sack is hurled into the Tiber. A nice dramatic splash. Onlookers gasp, maybe cross themselves depending on the era. It's a private death in public view. What's eerie is how dispassionate the crowd can be. They nod, they mumble, they move on. You've seen more fuss made over a botched bakery delivery. But that's Rome, practical, brutal, and profoundly invested in keeping the cosmic scales balanced. Parricide tips those scales, so Rome answers with a sack and a snake. What really gets you standing there as the brown river swallows its newest guest is how ritualistic it all feels. Not chaotic, not angry, just inevitable. And yet, there's always that question, why not just execute them? Why the animals? Why the sack? The logic isn't clean, but Rome never was. Scholars still puzzle over the origins. Some trace it back to Etruscan rites, others to obscure priestly codes, long forgotten. You remember a street performer once reenacting the scene with puppets. It was part satire, part warning. The kids laughed. The adults didn't. Even in play, some punishments cast a long, serious shadow. And then there's the real kicker. If the sack wasn't available, or animals were scarce, they sometimes skipped the fauna and used just the bag. A lonely, quiet drowning. No screams, no pecking. As you turn back toward home, you step over a bit of stray rope. It's damp, possibly from the sack. You don't pick it up. You're halfway through your evening wine when a passing soldier murmurs something about a traitor getting the flaming tunic. The tavern quiets for a moment, everyone silently processing the phrase. Then the usual hum returns, but a little edgier now, like everyone's suddenly aware of their own treasonous potential. You follow the scent of smoke, not too fast, not too obvious. You don't want to look eager. Romans, after all, enjoy their justice with a side of restraint. The forum's quieter than usual. A small crowd stands at a respectful distance, watching two grim-faced officials carry what looks like a folded garment in tongs. The tunica molesta, the annoying tunic, literally so, molesta undersells it. It's soaked in pitch, tightly sewn and stiff like a second skin. They're careful not to drip. It's punishment for arson treason, or desertion crimes that disrupt the fabric of Rome itself. Betray the state, and the state makes you wear its wrath. Literally. The condemned man, shaking strip, doesn't plead. He knows there's no point. This isn't one of those punishments with flexibility. It's final. They slip the tunic over him like a priest dressing an acolyte. Then they step back. A torch comes forward. You brace. Historians still debate whether the burning was immediate or whether the tunic first restricted breath and movement, turning the victim into a sort of living statue before flames took hold. Roman sources differ. Tacitus, Suetonius, they're all more interested in the symbolism than the logistics. But the effect is always the same. Silence crackled then, a shout that might be pain or defiance or both. The fire dances high, illuminating grim faces and marble columns. There's no feast after this one, no applause. Just the smell of pitch and char. You notice a child clutching their mother's hand tighter. Good. The message is working. Roman justice wasn't about individual reform. It was about reinforcing the state's authority through ritualized fear. The flaming tunic is spectacle, yes, but one with roots in military discipline. Some say it began as a punishment for soldiers who set fire to their own camps. Others believe it was borrowed from older Etruscan rites offerings of betrayal, burnt in full view of the gods. No one's sure. But the tunic reappears again and again in histories and plays, even in graffiti. Give him the tunic. One scrawl reads next to a crude drawing of a man on fire. Charming. You wonder about the executioner, who sews the tunic, who stores it between uses. There's a system, surely. Rome always has a system. As the crowd disperses, you linger a moment. There's only ash now. The tunic and the man inside are gone. But the memory stays etched into everyone's mind. That's the point. You head home, suddenly aware of how flammable your own clothes feel. You're walking past the Senate steps when you notice something missing. Not a person exactly, but a presence. A bust once sat here, a minor magistrate, you think, or maybe a general. Now the plinth is empty, scrubbed clean as if no one was ever honored there at all. That's damnatio memoriae, and it's colder than any execution. When Rome decides to punish you by forgetting you, it doesn't just ignore your memory, it wages war against it. You ask an older woman sitting nearby if she remembers who stood there. She squints. Some Marcus? Maybe, she says, then shrugs. That's how it starts the erosion. First the name, then the deeds, then the stories, until even the rumors lose their grip. The state orders your statues removed, inscriptions, chiseled out coins, melted or overstruck. You become absent, not just from history, but from shared thought. It's most often political emperors who fell from favored generals who plotted poorly, or senators who backed the wrong horse. But it could happen to almost anyone of status. If you embarrass the empire enough, it might pretend you never existed. Historians still argue whether this actually erased memory or just made it more intriguing. After all, when something's clearly been removed, people ask why. The blank spaces shout louder than the text. You remember hearing a teacher whisper that damnatio memoriae was a second death. The first kills the body. The second kills the legacy. For Romans obsessed with lineage and remembrance, this was often the cruelest blow. There's a famous example. Emperor Geta murdered by his brother Caracalla. Caracalla didn't just kill him, he purged Geta's name from every monument, every scroll, every speech. Even family portraits were scraped clean. Ironically, we know all about Geta now because of how thoroughly he was erased. It's a strange fate to be remembered for being forgotten. You spot a coin dealer by the fountain with a scratched silver denarius. He flips it to show the faint ghost of a face, almost erased, but not quite. Was someone important, he says. Once. There's a poetry to it, dark and elegant. Rome, in its need to control the future, created a punishment rooted entirely in the past. And you, modern mortal nosy, you can't help but remember the ones Rome tried hardest to erase. You walk on wondering if you'll see another blank plinth tomorrow. Probably. The city's always editing itself. You're up before dawn, the air cool and damp with river mist when you hear the chain gang pass. Bare feet on cobblestones, the rhythmic clink of iron, and the slow, groaning march of men who know they aren't coming back. They're headed east toward the mines. Rome doesn't often talk about this punishment, but it's one of its most brutal. Convicted criminals, rebellious, slaves, captured deserters. They all get the same destination, the imperial mines. Salt, lead gold, each mineral with its own specific torment. You once heard a merchant describe the mines of Sardinia as death with daylight. Open pits, no shelter, and guards with short tempers. Others, like the Dalmatian iron quarries, were worse underground, airless, and crawling with rot. The punishment isn't officially a death sentence, but everyone knows what it means. Most don't last a year. Some don't last a week. And even fewer come back whole. Historians still argue whether the mines were purely punitive or if they also served as an economic engine. After all, someone had to keep the empire's coinage flowing. Someone had to fuel the bathhouses and forge the weapons. You remember a story told in whispers about the mines at Lorien near Athens before Rome's time, how even children were made to crawl through the narrow shafts. Rome learned from them, improved the cruelty, made it more industrial. The men shuffling past you this morning wear tunics that were once white. Now, they're gray-brown with sweat and soil. One limps. Another stares ahead, unblinking, like his soul already made the trip and left his body behind. There are no goodbyes. Their families, if they had any, aren't allowed to follow. The state needs their labor, not their grief. The process is ruthlessly efficient. Conviction branding, shackling transport. No long trials. No elaborate public display. Just swift logistics and a road out of town. You hear a priest murmur a blessing barely loud enough to register. It's a mercy. Most wouldn't bother. What's strange is how ordinary it all looks. No dramatic flailing, no resistance. Just resignation. The crowd watches, not cheering, not booing, just acknowledging. This is Rome after all. The gears must keep turning. Later, you see one of the guards in a tavern laughing. He drinks sweet wine and eats olives by the handful. You wonder if he even remembers their faces, or if they all blend together like ore in a furnace. And then you think of that story, perhaps apocryphal, about a slave who escaped the mines and returned to Rome only to be recognized by his limp. They resentenced him, of course, but this time they didn't bother with shackles. They knew he'd never try again. The mines are a punishment with plausible deniability. There's no blood in the forum, no fire, no animals in sacks. Just vanishing. and silence. You walk past the eastern gate later that day. The road stretches on hot and white and endless. Somewhere out there, under earth and stone, men are digging so that Rome can shine. And they will dig and dig until they collapse. And then others will replace them. Rome always has someone else. The sentence is exile. You'd think that means freedom, a peaceful retreat to some coastal villa, time to write poetry, sip watered wine, maybe reconnect with nature. But in Rome, exile is a strange liminal punishment. You are neither condemned to death nor allowed to live properly. You are unpersoned, exported, and quarantined from public memory. It happens quickly. One day, you're attending banquets and arguing politics. In the forum the next, you're given a scroll detailing your new home, usually an island or some dusty corner of the provinces. The reason could be anything from slander to political misalignment to occasionally an emperor's bad mood. You remember when Publius, yes, that Publius was exiled for moral offenses, a phrase so vague even the scribes laughed when they copied it. He ended up in Corsica, surrounded by sheep and storms. His letters home started poetic. They ended in silence. Historians still argue whether exile was truly punishment or just administrative reshuffling. After all, many exiles lived comfortably. Ovid, famously banished to the Black Sea, complained endlessly, but still had patrons and servants. Yet others, less connected, less charming, died in obscurity, forgotten and ignored. What makes exile uniquely Roman is its emphasis on dignity lost. You're not shackled, but you're invisible. You're not tortured, but your social death is complete. No citizen can speak your name in Senate. Your home is seized. Your statues pulled down. In some cases, your friends are encouraged to forget you, and yet many tried to return. They wrote pleading letters, sent gifts to influential senators, even offered bribes to imperial advisors. Few succeeded. When they did, they returned, changed, quieter, humbler, their former bombast replaced by caution. You can always spot a returned exile by the way they avoid the Senate's western door. Superstition, maybe. You once met an exiled rhetorician in Massilia, a pale man with trembling hands who spoke in carefully measured tones. He offered free lessons to local boys, quoting Cicero through clenched teeth. At night, he paced his rented garden, always pausing to stare at the moon, as if it might carry messages back to Rome. Not all exiles were so passive. Some plotted. Some stirred rebellions. A few even succeeded briefly in reclaiming power. But more often, they disappeared into the margins of history, reduced to footnotes, remembered only because someone else mentioned them once. And that's the real sting of exile, not the place, but the erasure. Rome's memory is selective, its forgiveness rare. To be exiled is to live, but never quite matter again. You stop by a scribe's shop and notice a wax tablet etched faintly with the name of a disgraced senator. A child had scratched it out, then redrawn it poorly. The state would punish him if they noticed. But you don't tell. Instead, you keep walking, thinking of islands of letters lost to sea winds, and of voices once loud, now scattered like ashes on provincial roads. You're standing in the Colosseum. Not during a tour, not with a guide, no. You're there in its heyday. The sun is sharp, the crowd louder than a Roman bathhouse on discount day. and the air carries the unmistakable scent of sweat dust and freshly oiled weaponry. This isn't sport, this is punishment, and everyone's here for the show. Rome had no shortage of crimes, nor of criminals, but some the state decided needed a public reckoning. Not the silent sack, not exile, not even the mines. No, these men and women were sentenced to damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Think of it as justice served with a roar. The gates creak open. A man unarmed stumbles into the sand. He blinks against the light. Somewhere nearby, a lion snarls. You feel your breath catch. This isn't just punishment. It's performance. Historians still argue whether the animals were starved beforehand to ensure bloodshed. Some say yes, after all. A lazy leopard ruins the drama. Others argue the unpredictability was part of the spectacle. Would the beast strike? Would the condemned run? Would the audience see courage or comedy? Sometimes it wasn't a simple execution. Sometimes they staged myths. A thief condemned for sacrilege might be dressed as Orpheus, then mauled by bears playing the role of Thracian women. One account tells of a man sentenced to reenact the fall of Icarus, flung from a constructed cliff with feathered arms to laughter and applause. And then there were the condemned criminals, forced to fight each other weaponless, while dressed as legendary enemies. Hannibal versus Scipio, but with real fear and less training. It was punishment, and theater blended so seamlessly that even the crowd sometimes forgot this was once a human being. You feel the sun climb higher. The crowd is still howling. The lion lunges. It's over fast. Or maybe slow. It depends on how willing the beast is to go. You shift uncomfortably. You're not the only one. There's a senator nearby who winces as a second man is dragged out young, barely more than a boy. His crime? Probably theft, or maybe just bad luck. The court system wasn't always precise, yet no one leaves. The stands stay full. The vendors keep selling dates and cooled wine. Justice is exhausting after all. You overhear someone quote Seneca, "He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a man who is alive." Easy to say from the marble seats. Some days, the Colosseum hosted hundreds of deaths. Other days, only a few. It depended on the schedule, the emperor's mood, and whether any foreign dignitaries needed impressing. You think of the logistics. Where do they find this many leopards? Who trains the elephants? How do they clean the sand afterward? Rome had answers to all of it. There were special trainers, specialized crews for carcass removal, and even rotating sand to absorb blood. No detail was too small when it came to public execution, because it wasn't just justice, it was brand management. The empire showing its strength, its culture, its dominance over nature and man alike. And somewhere quietly the condemned disappear. No names carved into walls. No tombstones. Just bones in the sand scraped away before the next act. You walk home under a red sky, your ears still ringing with applause for justice. The morning begins. Like most in Rome, vendors shouting children, squabbling sandals, slapping across sun-warmed flagstones. But by midday, there's a different energy in the air. A crowd is forming in the forum, not for spectacle or sport, but for something more humiliating. Today, someone will face humiliatio publica, public shame, Roman style. You push your way to the front, careful not to look too eager. Rome frowns, on overt enthusiasm for misery, unless it's an official festival. But make no mistake, this is punishment with a crowd, and Rome knows how to do crowds. The condemned is already in the square, roped to a post, stripped to the waist. His crime fraud, or maybe impersonating a magistrate. The details are foggy. What matters is what comes next: degradation, and lots of it. Public shame was a punishment that required no weapons, only words and attention. Sometimes it involved placards describing the crime slung around the neck like a necklace of disgrace. Other times, it was worse: hair shaving, forced wearing of ridiculous clothing, or being paraded on a donkey backwards. Historians still argue whether these acts were truly effective deterrents or just social theater. But one thing is clear: they worked because you were watching. The humiliation wasn't internal. It was shared, amplified, embellished. The guards allow a speaker to announce the man's name and crime. It echoes across the square. Children laugh. A woman spits. A teenager shouts something about a coward's toga. The crowd begins to mimic chant. Turn this punishment into performance. You remember reading that even some senators, when disgraced, were subjected to such rituals, not just the poor. Once, a wealthy patrician was sentenced to wear a woman's tunic and sweep the temple steps because he had mocked the Vestal virgins. He never recovered politically. The Roman sense of dignity was sharp and fragile. An insult in public meant more than a stab in the back alley. That's why this punishment worked so well. It didn't need blood, just exposure. Sometimes the condemned were forced to mime their crime. A thief might be made to steal loaves of bread from invisible stalls while being jeered. A false witness might be instructed to lie to a group of street actors reenacting a courtroom. It was ridiculous, theatrical, and weirdly effective. You think of the woman who was once caught faking noble lineage, her sentence to be walked through the forum wearing symbols of every class: plebeian shoes, patrician jewelry, and slave chains, all while a child read out a fake genealogy scroll behind her. She wept the whole way. What stings most about public shame is how long it lingers. People forget crimes, but they remember jokes. A man who was mocked once might never be able to walk through a market again without hearing the same chant, the same nickname. Justice in Rome could be cruel, but humor made it stick. Today's condemned stands silent. His eyes dart between faces, searching for pity. There is none. Not here. Not now. Not in the place where everyone is reminded loudly that they're still not that person. You turn away after the ropes are cut. The man is free now, technically. But you know, and he knows he's not free at all. His punishment follows him like a stray dog, silent, persistent, and impossible to ignore. There's a quiet tension in the Roman camp today. Not the kind that precedes battle, but the kind that hovers when someone is about to be judged. You walk past ranks of legionaries, standing rigidly still, their expressions blank. That's never a good sign. At the center of the encampment, a young soldier kneels. His hands are bound behind his back, and he's surrounded slowly, deliberately, by members of his own unit. They don't speak. They carry clubs. This is not a criminal trial, not in the civic sense. It's a military proceeding, and the sentence is clear fustuarium. The word itself is simple, derived from fustus, meaning club or cudgel. But the punishment it represents is anything but. Reserved for offenses like desertion theft from fellow soldiers, false testimony, or abandoning a post-fustuarium, is not administered by judges or executioners. It is carried out by your peers. And that is the horror of it. Historians like Polybius describe it with grim admiration. The condemned is first beaten by the commanding officer, then surrounded by his fellow legionaries, sometimes his friends, and clubbed to death. The act is both punishment and purification. An infection is being cut out, not with a scalpel, but with a bludgeon. You watch in silence as the circle closes. The first strike lands with a sickening crack. The man jerks, but no one moves to stop it. The second blow comes, then another, then another. The rhythm builds, not frantic, but methodical. This is a ritual after all. The logic behind fustuarium is coldly elegant. In the Roman military, unity is survival. One weak link, a coward, a thief, a liar, could unravel an entire cohort. Trust is sacred. Betray it, and you die at the hands of those who need to trust you most. You imagine what it must be like to lift your club against someone you drank with, trained with, perhaps even saved in battle. Rome didn't just enforce punishment, it made you complicit in it. There's a reason why desertion was considered such a heinous crime. A deserter didn't just abandon a post, he abandoned Rome. He endangered the men next to him. And in a world where your brothers in arms were often the only thing standing between you and death, that was unforgivable. The crowd eventually disperses. What's left is a body broken, still oddly peaceful, and the silence of soldiers returning to their duties as if nothing happened. You once read that the fear of fustuarium kept legions in line more than any command. After all, who wants to be beaten to death by the men you swore to stand beside? And here's the other side of Roman logic. The punishment wasn't just about justice. It was about reinforcement. By forcing the unit to carry out the execution, Rome tightened the bond between those who remained. They shared guilt, they shared fear, and most importantly, they shared survival. You walk away from the clearing slowly. The dust has begun to settle, and the stain on the ground is already drying. But the feeling remains heavier than any armor, colder than any steel. Because Rome did not simply punish the body, it punished the soul and the society around it. You're seated at the edge of a temporary wooden stage in the Forum Boarium. A small crowd gathers: merchants, closing shop, early children, perched on their parents' shoulders, even a few toga-clad officials pretending not to enjoy themselves too much. At center stage stands a man not particularly remarkable, except for the fact that he's painted head to toe in white clay, with exaggerated red cheeks and a terrified expression. Around him, costumed actors in stylized masks begin a performance. But this isn't a comedy or a mythological reenactment. This is a sentence. He has been condemned not to death, not to exile, not even to a fine. His punishment is public pantomime, and the subject of the play, his own crime. Welcome to one of Rome's stranger judicial practices, where punishment blurs into performance, and the boundary between shame and spectacle disappears entirely. The roots of this ritualized punishment trace back to Rome's fascination with theater and public oratory. For the Romans, the stage wasn't just entertainment, It was education, politics, and morality rolled into one. What better way to warn others than to turn a criminal's actions into a live-action cautionary tale? And so, certain minor crimes, petty theft, public drunkenness, defamation, were sometimes punished by compelling the offender to take part in or be depicted by others in a dramatic representation of their wrongdoing. Let's be clear, this wasn't a whimsical punishment. It was carefully scripted, often rehearsed, and imbued with ritual significance. The goal wasn't only to mock, but to instruct. One surviving commentary by a jurist named Ulpius Marcellus describes an incident where a shopkeeper who sold spoiled fish was made to walk through the forum carrying a wooden fish painted green with flies glued to its surface, while actors mimed vomiting and clutching their stomachs. "Let all see what rot he sells," the magistrate reportedly said. In another case, recorded in a provincial inscription in Gaul, a man accused of falsely posing as a veteran was sentenced to participate in a reenactment of a triumph. Except in this version, he was dressed in crude armor, pushed in a cart, and pelted with cabbage leaves rather than laurel wreaths. Humor and humiliation went hand in hand. Roman audiences loved these moral plays. To them, justice wasn't simply about deterrence, it was about display. The city itself was a stage, and every citizen was part of the performance. The state didn't just punish wrongdoing, it curated it, dramatized it, made it visible and memorable. The role of mime actors in this system was crucial. Unlike standard actors, mime performers often worked without masks and relied on exaggerated facial expressions and gestures. They played criminals, gods, prostitutes, even animals. They exaggerated everything: the fall from grace, the moment of guilt, the punishment received. In many cases, the condemned didn't even speak. Their silence was part of the act, a kind of living effigy, a canvas upon which the actors painted the moral message. It was justice turned inside out, a sentence you didn't just serve, but embodied. But not everyone approved. The Stoic philosopher Seneca criticized the practice harshly. In one of his letters, he laments that Rome makes light of justice and turns correction into comedy. He argued that punishment should be swift, firm, and dignified, not theatricalized for the pleasure of the crowd. And yet the practice persisted for centuries. In the time of Augustus, a man who had forged adoption papers to claim inheritance was sentenced to mime his crime every Saturnalia festival for 5 years. On those days, he wore baby clothes, cried like an infant, and signed a giant wax scroll while actors read out fake family trees. It was grotesque and unforgettable. There were limits, of course. Senators and equestrians were rarely subjected to mimed punishment. This was a plebeian spectacle designed for the masses. And sometimes the punishment went too far. One recorded incident in the late 3rd century tells of a thief whose crime was reperformed in a mime act that ended in real injury. The actors, caught up in their performance, struck him too hard with a prop club. The crowd laughed, the magistrate did not. Regulations were tightened afterward, yet there's something undeniably effective in the method. Even today, the phrases we use act out public shaming, playing the fool echo back to this Roman idea of justice as theater. You imagine what it must have felt like standing on that makeshift stage, watching your own downfall performed by strangers, knowing every grimace, every stumble, every mistake would be etched into the memory of the crowd, not only punished, but parodied, your name becoming a punchline. One wonders whether it was more merciful than flogging or infinitely worse. In modern terms, we might compare it to community service or viral public apologies. But Rome didn't have social media. It had the street, the forum, the stage. And the message was always the same. Your actions are not only known, they are now content. And content in Rome lived longer than memory. As you step away from the stage, the last lines of the performance echo behind you, a raucous chorus laughing and chanting the criminal's name with a rhyme tacked on to make it stick. A child beside you repeats it. He won't forget, neither will you. This is justice Roman style. Brutal, brilliant, and bizarrely theatrical. It begins with a chicken. Not a metaphorical chicken, a real one. White-feathered squawking, terrified, tied with a leather cord to the magistrate's bench in a dusty provincial forum. You squint. This has to be a joke, right? But no one's laughing. The scribe is taking notes. The accuser stands solemnly, describing damage to his barley field. The judge, bored but dutiful, nods and scratches his chin. And the accused? Well, it's the chicken. Or rather, it's the idea of the chicken. Because in ancient Rome, even animals could be held accountable. Welcome to the odd, unsettling world of Roman courtroom logic. Roman law, in all its complexity and flexibility, allowed for the prosecution of animals. The legal reasoning was part superstition, part symbolic justice, and part practical civic order. A creature that disrupted the peace, destroyed sacred objects, or contributed to death could be tried, sentenced, and sometimes even executed. Most modern historians treat these cases with caution. Some dismiss them as rural folklore, others as misunderstood rituals. But multiple sources, Pliny the Elder, Aelian, even Cicero, hint that Rome took these matters more seriously than we might expect. The most famous case, probably the pig that killed a child. According to Valerius Maximus, the animal was formally tried, convicted, and then executed. Executed how? That's lost to time. But some believe it may have been crucified. Yes, crucified, like a human criminal. Rome didn't half punish. What's fascinating isn't just the act of trying an animal. It's the logic behind it. For Rome, the cosmos was built on order. Every citizen, every building, every god had their place. An animal that violated that order by trampling a sacred grove, by biting a priest, or by defiling a temple offering was more than a nuisance. It was a rupture, a breach in the fabric of divine justice. And breaches must be repaired. Some sentences were brutal. Pigs and goats were sometimes burned alive if they damaged sacred altars. Birds were drowned in wine as part of ritual purifications. Dogs were publicly flogged during the annual Lupercalia festival, not because they'd done anything wrong, but as scapegoats for past failures to protect the city. Then there's the curious case of bees. Yes, bees. One account tells of a beekeeper who was fined when his swarm settled near a sacred spring and was believed to have drunk from it, thus polluting the water. The bees were symbolically banished, and the keeper was required to sacrifice a white lamb to cleanse the site. The bees, being bees, were unaware of their exile. But that didn't matter. The ritual was performed for the gods, not the insects. Other stories veer even stranger. In one documented case from a Roman colony in Hispania, a monkey allegedly stole food from an open temple. The elders convened a hearing. The monkey was asked to leave the city's holy district. When it returned weeks later, it was captured and put to death not by beating or blade, but through a form of ritual suffocation, its body placed beneath a cursed statue. Some historians argue these trials were never truly legal, that they were symbolic reenactments, ritual scapegoating, akin to the ancient Greek pharmakos ceremony, where a chosen victim was paraded and then expelled or killed to cleanse a city's sins. But not all trials were religious. In agricultural regions, domestic animals were sometimes held responsible for property damage or even deaths. If a cow trampled a child, it might be slaughtered under magistrate order, not as vengeance, but as a kind of rough justice, an acknowledgement that the social contract extended, however faintly, to animals. You remember reading a fragment of legal commentary, possibly from Gaius or Paulus, that stated, "In all cases where blood has been spilled and no free man has confessed, the gods must have an answer." Sometimes, animals were that answer. Even insects had their moment. Pliny the Elder records that locusts, when causing widespread crop destruction, were sometimes banished by decree. In one instance, priests held a trial for the infestation itself. The locusts were declared enemies of the state, and a symbolic trench was dug where offerings were buried to appease the gods of fertility. Farmers, understandably, kept swatting. What does all this say about Roman law? That it wasn't always rational by modern standards, but it was consistent. In one regard, it sought order. And in a world where omens, portents, and divine favor ruled everything from crops to careers, ignoring even the smallest disruption could feel like inviting chaos. This obsession with cosmic balance spilled into the city itself. In urban Rome, the line between legal decree and public performance was always thin. A black dog seen entering a temple during a thunderstorm might spark a whole series of purifying rituals, with witnesses testifying before magistrates about which god had been insulted. You think again about that chicken tied up blinking in the sun. Its fate probably not death. Perhaps public sale with the proceeds donated to the offended party. Maybe it was released with a prayer or relocated far from the scene of the crime. But the ritual mattered more than the result. Even now, the echoes of these odd rituals survive. Modern law retains vestiges of such symbolic thinking, the ceremonial language of courts, the anthropomorphizing of corporations, the ritual structure of sentencing. We no longer prosecute pigs, but we still seek to embody justice through symbols, robes, gavels, oaths. In a way, Rome wasn't so different. It just made its point more theatrical. As you leave the forum, you glance back at the magistrate's bench. The chicken is gone. The field owner is still arguing with the scribe. A boy laughs nearby, mimicking a rooster's cry. You smile, but not mockingly. Because for all its absurdity, the trial made sense to them. And in some strange, poetic way, that chicken served its purpose. It reminded a society so deeply entangled with God's land and ritual that justice doesn't always need to be sensible. It just needs to be seen. You're standing in the Basilica Julia Rome's sprawling center of legal affairs. Sunlight streams through open arches, illuminating rows of magistrates and petitioners. There's a hum of parchment and protest sandals slapping against marble, and voices layered in a dozen overlapping arguments. But here, in the very heart of Roman law, a quiet truth flickers beneath the noise. Justice in Rome wasn't blind. She peeked beneath the folds of her toga to see your social class, your family name, your patron, and your fortune. The law was many things. In Rome, strict, efficient, sometimes visionary, but equal rarely. Today, two men stand trial. One is Lucius Tullius, a wealthy equestrian caught defrauding a minor temple of several hundred denarii. The other is Gaius, a freedman, accused of stealing 3 loaves of bread from a market stall. Both stand in the same hall in front of similar benches, but their paths through Roman justice could not be more different. Lucius arrives with 3 advocates, hired orators, in crisp togas who speak not only well, but with lineage behind them. His family owns land in Campania. His uncle once served as a consul. The magistrate greets him by name. Gaius has no advocate. He speaks haltingly, nervously. He bows too often. The magistrate doesn't ask his name. He refers to him as the man from the Suburra. Let's talk about what's really happening here. Roman law, especially after the 12 tables, did technically apply to all citizens. It offered basic rights protection from arbitrary punishment legal procedure appeals. But those rights were filtered through layers of privilege. First, the punishment hierarchy. A patrician caught committing murder might be fined or exiled if convicted at all. A poor plebeian accused of the same, he risked crucifixion. Crucifixion was in fact explicitly forbidden for Roman citizens in many cases. But citizen was often used selectively. Freedmen, women provincials, and slaves had no such protection. The execution method said more about your social status than your crime. For example, desertion. A wealthy officer found guilty of abandoning his post might be quietly dismissed or retired. A foot soldier caught doing the same faced fustuarium, the infamous death by beating at the hands of fellow legionaries. Consider theft. Petty theft by a noble, usually punished by restitution. Return the goods, pay a fine, perhaps apologize publicly. But theft by a slave that could lead to branding, mutilation, or death. One law stated that if a slave was caught stealing during the Saturnalia, he could be executed without trial. After all, who would he appeal to? And then there's testimony. Not everyone could testify in court. Slaves, for instance, could only testify under torture on the assumption that they'd lie otherwise. Women's testimonies were often disregarded unless supported by a male guardian. Freedmen could speak, but were often dismissed by elite jurists as unreliable or impassioned. One chilling example survives in the Digest of Justinian. A slave girl witnessed her master's murder. She knew the killer could identify him and was willing to speak, but she wasn't permitted to testify unless tortured first. She was. She died before the trial ended. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence. Meanwhile, Gaius the bread thief is being sentenced. His punishment, public flogging and 6 months in a work gang assigned to municipal upkeep. Lucius the temple fraud was found guilty too, but he's offered exile to his family's estate in Baiae. with the option to return after a year and pay a voluntary temple donation. Technically, they've both been punished, but you feel the difference in your bones. The divide didn't stop at the courtroom. Rome's legal access was structured through patronage. A poor citizen could only bring a case with the help of a patron, a wealthy man who spoke on his behalf. But a patron had dozens of clients. He chose carefully. If your case wasn't politically useful or socially flattering, it wasn't brought. Even legal language reflected this divide. Elite cases were argued with legal Latin, littered with precedent and scholarly citations. Plebeian cases, crude, sometimes rushed. Some magistrates openly complained about commoners clogging the courts with petty concerns. And yet, to its credit, Rome occasionally tried to correct these imbalances. Emperor Hadrian introduced reforms to protect vulnerable populations, especially slaves and women, from abusive prosecutions. He limited the use of torture, promoted the idea of imperial appeal, and created a kind of legal ombudsman role known as the praefectus vigilum to help citizens file complaints. Under the Antonines, more laws emerged to prevent extreme punishments for minor crimes. Flogging was restricted. Banishment had to follow a formal hearing. And during the Severan period, edicts were issued allowing women to manage their dowries and property with fewer male intermediaries. But these were patches on a frayed toga. The core structure remained class-determined outcome. And it wasn't just within Rome. Provincials, non-Roman citizens living in Gaul, Syria, Britannia had even fewer protections. Their disputes were often settled by military governors. If a Roman killed a provincial farmer in Hispania, the farmer's family might appeal for compensation. If a provincial killed a Roman, the entire village might be punished. Roman colonial law, the ius gentium, was a mixed blessing. It standardized governance, but often enforced Roman values over local customs. Local nobles gained access to the courts. Everyone else got the edge of the sword. You reflect on what it means to be judged under such a system, to know that your guilt or innocence matters less than your toga's hemline, your patron's name, your birthplace. To watch your fate decided not by evidence, but by etiquette. And yet Romans believed deeply in their law. The forum bustled every day with lawsuits, petitions, arbitrations. Legal culture was so central that children were trained to memorize case law. Rhetoric schools taught boys not just to speak, but to argue, to defend, to prosecute. Justice was an ideal, just not an equal one. You walk through the basilica, Julia's shaded corridor, and find a stone relief depicting Libertas, the personification of liberty. She holds a rod and wears a veil. Underneath, someone has scratched a small graffiti inscription. Justitia rides with 2 horses, one fat, one starving. You smile. Even in antiquity, people understood irony. By the time you reach the outer archway, the sun has shifted. The sound of another sentence being passed echoes faintly behind you. You don't turn back. You already know who the sentence was for and who it wasn't. You stand at the edge of the Roman Forum one last time. The sun is low. The stones are warm, but the breeze carries a chill. It's quiet now, the kind of quiet that lets you hear the ghosts, the clink of chains, the soft thud of a club, the distant laughter of a crowd watching justice served like theater. And you wonder how much of this is truly gone. Rome's strangest punishments, the sack of snakes, the flaming tunic, the cursed tablets, the mimed trials, feel like relics of a brutal past. But if you listen closely, echoes remain in our laws, in our customs, in the architecture of justice itself. Because Rome didn't just shape cities and empires, it shaped punishment. It turned consequence into ceremony. And some of those ceremonies, however, softened, modernized, or sanitized, still define how we understand guilt order and discipline today. Let's start with the symbol of the fasces. It was everywhere in Rome, a bundle of rods bound together, often with an axe in the middle. Carried by lictors in front of magistrates, it represented unity through strength, many sticks bound as one, and the power to punish, to flog, to execute. We still use that symbol. Look closely at old courthouses in Europe, at the U.S. Senate seal, even on early 20th century American dimes. The fasces lives on, not as a tool of execution, but as a badge of law and order. Rome's power polished into civility. Then there's exile. Modern criminal justice rarely banishes people to literal islands anymore, though transportation to penal colonies like Australia wasn't so long ago. But consider probation. Consider house arrest. Consider how we socially exile individuals through defamation cancellation or legal restrictions. The form has changed. The principal removal separation shaming remains. Or take the Roman idea of damnatio memoriae, the erasure of a person from history. Today, we don't chisel names off statues. Well, not often, but we do deplatform. We remove honorary degrees. We take down monuments, sometimes rightly, sometimes too hastily. But the concept of denying legacy as punishment is thoroughly Roman. Memory, as the Romans knew, is a battlefield. And what of public spectacle? You may not see people fed to lions in an amphitheater, but consider how punishment is still performed. A courtroom sketch, aired on cable news, a mugshot circulated online, a sentencing live-streamed and dissected in real time. Justice is still a kind of theater. Rome taught us to make punishment visible to ensure the audience learns as much as the accused. Even the very language of modern law bears Rome's fingerprints. Subpoena, habeas corpus, alibi, all Latin. All from the time when to be a lawyer was to be trained in rhetoric, not merely statute. The Romans didn't separate law from language. They knew the power of words to bind, break, and burn. But Rome's legacy isn't just about continuity. It's about caution. Because for every innovation Rome gave us, it also gave us a warning. The idea that justice could be too performative, more about control than correction. The risk of a system that judges the poor more harshly than the rich. The danger of using punishment not just to discourage, but to entertain. Rome reached incredible legal heights, but it also teetered close to tyranny. Take the legal theater of the late empire. Under emperors like Caligula or Nero, law became theater in the worst way. Punishments were exaggerated, politicized, and weaponized. Accusations flew as tools of power. Trials were held in private or worse, parodied on stage before the real sentence came. The line between spectacle and sadism blurred. Modern legal systems have safeguards now due process, appeals rights of the accused. But even those are tested in moments of fear or populism. Rome reminds us that law, left unchecked, can become another form of violence dressed in the robes of order. And yet, the brilliance of Rome endures. Their legal code, compiled centuries later under Emperor Justinian, became the foundation of civil law in Europe. The idea of codified law, accessible, written, organized, was revolutionary. So too was the notion of legal precedent of equality before the law, even if aspirational, and of rights that survive the ruler. It's no exaggeration to say that every courtroom gavel, every legal appeal, every constitutional clause owes something somewhere to Roman thought. Even their stranger punishments had a kind of logic. The poena culae was absurd, yes, but it said something profound. Killing one's parent was more than murder. It was an attack on society's root, a break in the chain of continuity, a crime that couldn't be punished with mere death. The curse tablets. They weren't just superstition. They were desperation made tangible. A way for the voiceless to speak, to scream, to summon justice when the courts ignored them. The mimed reenactments, a fusion of justice and art. Shaming through storytelling. Ridiculous, maybe, but unforgettable, definitely. And then there's the Roman sense of proportion. They understood that punishment must be legible to the people. That consequences, to be effective, must be seen, felt, understood. Not hidden away. Not clinical, but human. Flawed, emotional, real. You think of the streets of Rome, of slaves whipped in public, of senators forced to suicide, of thieves marched through markets in chains. It's horrific, and it's human, because at its core, Roman justice wasn't just about the law. It was about narrative. Every punishment told a story of betrayal, of discipline, of pride, of state power. Today, we do the same, though we may not say so. We frame legal battles in moral terms. We cast villains and victims. We write headlines that echo the graffiti of ancient walls. Rome taught us how to tell stories through law. It's up to us to decide which ones to repeat and which to rewrite. As the sun finally sets behind the Capitoline Hill, the shadows lengthen across the stone. You hear laughter from a distant tavern, the clang of a closing gate, and the whisper of a past that never quite disappeared. The punishments of Rome were cruel, strange, unforgettable. But they were never meaningless. They were mirrors, and we're still looking into them. You're not a tourist or a soldier tonight, not even a senator. You're a fly on the wall, drifting silently behind the backs of bakers, servants, gossipers, and one very confused goat who's had far too much fermented fig mash. That's right, tonight we're plunging gently into the oddly poetic world of Roman punishments, but not the arena stuff. No gladiator bloodbaths, no lion-feeding frenzies. Instead, you're drifting into the quieter, funnier, more human side of Roman justice. Picture small betrayals, low-stakes crimes, and the delightfully bizarre penalties they sometimes carried. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and feel free to comment where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing that. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The hour is late. You're padding quietly past the Forum Pulbuarium, once a cattle market now silent. The shadow of a marble ox head looms over you from the temple wall. Somewhere, someone's clattering a wine jug against a curb. A whispery breeze wafts up the smell of garum, the infamous fish sauce that even Romans admitted could knock you sideways. You turn down a side alley and pause. A goat is tied to a post beside a stone step. Its eyes are glassy. It's swaying slightly, and beneath it lies a puddle that strongly suggests someone let it sip from a discarded amphora of sour wine. A small crowd watches. A boy snickers. An older man, probably the beast's owner, mutters something about dishonor and public nuisance. This goat, you realize, is in trouble. You drift closer and recall what you've heard drunken animals in Rome weren't always laughed off. If the animal was considered to cause harm, even mildly, Roman custom sometimes demanded a response. Not because goats were expected to follow the 12 tables, but because public order was sacred, and every creature under Roman skies was part of the civic machine. This goat, despite its wobble, was now evidence in a case, an example perhaps, of how even the lowest creatures could upset the rhythm of Roman life. Some sources say goats were lashed with small rods, paraded in wreaths of garlic as a mark of shame, or even sacrificed, depending on the mood of the presiding magistrate. In this case, though, the animal simply lets out a loud bleating hiccup and topples gently onto its side. The crowd laughs. Someone tosses a fig, and the magistrate, who's been leaning in the shadows the whole time, declares the punishment sufficient. The goat will be denied fresh mash for a week. A gentle sentence. But make no mistake, Rome was not always so forgiving. Turn the corner now, just a few houses down. A window is open. From it, you hear whispered voices. Two slaves, sweeping the atrium of a patrician villa, are deep in conversation. Their Latin is quick and clipped, practiced, and low. You can't catch every word, but the gist is clear. They're speculating about their mistress's sudden stomach illness and the absence of a certain male visitor. Gossip in any century is a favorite pastime of the powerless. But in ancient Rome, idle whispers could spiral into real consequences. The paterfamilias master of the house had legal authority over everyone under his roof. If a slave's tongue strayed too far, punishment ranged from the mildly theatrical to the unforgettably humiliating. Some householders made eavesdropping slaves wear tags around their necks like a dog's collar, inscribed with phrases like "Servus sum, si me videris fugere tene me, I am a slave. If you see me running, catch me." Others ordered gossipers to repeat what they'd said while holding burning coals in their palms, an act more symbolic than sadistic, designed to make loose tongues fear literal heat. And still, historians argue whether these punishments were common law social custom or theatrical embellishment. Maybe a mix. You float up past the atrium now, brushing the painted walls where scenes of Bacchic feasts shimmer in torchlight. You imagine a dinner party here not long ago. At that feast, a talking parrot kept in a bronze cage hung from the rafters had learned a word or two too well. "Caesar stultus est," it had squawked one morning. "Caesar is a fool." Guests had laughed. The host less so. Birds, especially parrots and mynas, were popular novelties among Rome's wealthy. Some were trained to recite poetry, others to mimic the voices of absent lovers. But when they repeated treasonous phrases, even in jest, things got tense. Pliny the Elder writes of birds trained to say both greetings and insults, and of how some were burned silenced, or if they spoke sweetly enough, exonerated. You wonder if the parrot in this villa met a feathered fate, or if perhaps it was bribed with grapes and taught new verses from Virgil. Another street, another strange scene. A man is led through the forum, barefoot, with a garland of turnip greens on his head. His tunic is inside out. Children follow chanting a rhyme. He's not a criminal technically. He's a debtor who defaulted on payment to a sausage vendor during Saturnalia, and the punishment, as agreed in court, is public foolishness. In Rome, punishment wasn't always about harm. Sometimes it was about balance. A butcher who sold bad meat might be forced to wear a wreath of spoiled sausages. A baker who underweighed his loaves might have to serve his bread while wearing a chain of millstones. These weren't necessarily state-sanctioned penalties, but Rome, ever theatrical, knew how to mix civic correction with a bit of flair. Back in your alley, you pause. Somewhere, a flute is playing softly. Above you, someone lights a clay lamp. Below, in a doorway, a slave kneels rubbing vinegar into a stain on the step. You wonder if it's punishment or simply Tuesday. You remember the goat, the gossip, the parrot, the man with his leafy crown. And slowly you realize punishment in ancient Rome wasn't just about rules. It was about spectacle, about rhythm, about making sure everyone from senator to slave to goat played their part in the strange, fragile harmony of the empire. It's quiet now. A breeze stirs the curtains. Someone snores faintly behind a shutter. You keep drifting. The next morning arrives with a soft drizzle, dampening the tiled roofs of Rome and making the limestone streets gleam like wet parchment. You're moving again this time, behind a man pulling a reluctant goat through a narrow passageway just beyond the Subura district. The goat's hooves clatter on the stone, leaving tiny muddy prints, and it smells like sour wine and hay. You recognize it. This is yesterday's criminal goat, apparently not finished with its judicial journey. Here in the Roman Republic, you're learning quickly that justice doesn't always involve judges in red togas or elaborate marble halls. Sometimes, justice means dragging a misbehaving goat down to the temple steps, where elders argue over whether the animal knocked over a sacred oil lamp or merely startled a priest. And either way, it seems the goats had a bit too much fermented fig mash. Again, its breath could topple a senator. In early Rome, animals could be put on trial. Livestock dogs, and even birds. Anything that interacted with human society might end up accused of crimes, especially if their actions caused harm. A plow ox that trampled a child, a dog that bit a noble, or in this case, a goat, who disturbed a ritual procession. These were not just unfortunate events. They were seen as cosmic disturbances, omens even that required balancing. You overhear one priest muttering that the goat should be garlanded with garlic and led backward through the forum as a form of purification. Another recommends a symbolic fine 1 amphora of vinegar and a wheel of spoiled cheese. The crowd murmurs, torn between reverence and amusement. This is a trial after all, if an unconventional one. In this city, people believed that justice was a living thing. It could be soothed or angered, It responded to ritual, to offerings, and yes, to symbolic drama. The goat doesn't understand any of this, of course. It just bleats pitifully, head lolling, and gnaws half-heartedly at a flower garland now drooping over its horns. Finally, the priests decide no physical punishment. Instead, the goat is to be paraded past 3 temples wearing a crown of radishes, led by a boy ringing a bell. Why radishes? No one is sure. Possibly because they symbolize shame, or maybe just because they're in season. In either case, the goat is now a walking cautionary tale, a vegetable-wreathed, wine-soaked symbol of rural mischief in an urban world. You follow the parade for a bit, smiling quietly as vendors' children and one deeply skeptical dog watch the procession pass. Everyone seems to enjoy the absurdity, even if no one can agree on whether it's law custom or just another Roman day. Now, shift scenes into the quieter courtyards where domestic punishments unfold. Inside a modest domus, you observe another ritual in progress. A young servant girl stands beside a tall amphora head, bowed. She's barely 12. Her mistake. Using her mistress's imported saffron to dye her tunic, lining a minor act of vanity, but one that crosses a line. The punishment is not violent. Instead, the girl is made to wash garments for the entire household while wearing a ridiculous hat, a towering stack of laundry tied to her head with rough cord. The others are forbidden from helping her until sunset. It's part discipline, part performance, and entirely Roman in its creativity. This kind of punishment was known in some circles as poena ridicula, a ridiculous penalty. Designed not to hurt, but to teach, often through embarrassment or mild inconvenience, it reflected the Roman belief that shame could be more effective than pain. It also had the added bonus of entertaining the household, reinforcing social hierarchy, and burning a memory into the mind of the accused. You wonder how long this tradition lasted. Historians still argue whether such punishments were standard practice or exaggerated in satirical poems and anecdotes. But the logic behind them is consistent. In Rome, even minor disruptions required correction. Now, step into the peristyle garden, where an older male slave is explaining to a younger one why he once had to carry a live goose in each arm for 3 days straight. The punishment: forgetting to lock the villa gates, which allowed 2 geese to wander in and ruin a diplomatic dinner. The geese, ironically, became famous in Roman lore for their alertness, especially after reportedly saving the capital during a Gallic attack by honking furiously. So the punishment was not only absurd, but symbolically appropriate. If you can't match the vigilance of a goose, then you must serve as their bearer. It's this curious mix of symbolism and satire that defines Roman justice at its gentler, more comedic edges. You're beginning to see that in this culture, punishment often became performance, a living morality play that reinforced community expectations and injected a bit of humor into an otherwise rigid social order. Now let's move to a crowded street market where a merchant is berating a teenage boy. The boy, an apprentice, accidentally sold a customer a jug of olive oil that had gone rancid. The penalty issued, not by a court, but by the merchant himself, is elegant in its theatricality. The boy must carry the offending jug through the market, loudly proclaiming, "Beware, this is not the oil you want." He's mortified, of course, but as you watch him shout his slogan like a street corner herald, You also catch the amused glances from the crowd. This isn't about cruelty, it's about memory. The next time he opens a jug, he'll sniff it twice. Interestingly, this sort of symbolic correction was not limited to servants or slaves. Even citizens faced similar treatments. Debtors were occasionally made to wear placards around their necks, announcing their misdeeds. A baker caught using too much chalk in his flour might have his name painted in coal on the bakery wall. Romans were surprisingly egalitarian in their embarrassment tactics. Historians still debate the frequency of such penalties. Were they widespread or exceptional? Were they real or literary inventions? But among the many scrolls and fragments, the pattern emerges. Romans valued order, but they didn't always reach for the whip or sword. Sometimes a good laugh or a long walk with geese did the trick. Back at the forum steps, the goat returns, still wearing its radish wreath, still bleating softly. It's no longer the center of attention. A street performer is juggling clay cups beside a lawyer arguing about inheritance laws. Life moves on. You drift past up a quiet side street where a mosaic glints under the moonlight. It shows the goddess Fortuna, blindfolded, holding a cornucopia in one hand and a wheel in the other. A reminder, perhaps, that fate turns for everyone, goats included. The day is over now. The goat is asleep. The girl's laundry is drying on a rope line. The boy with the rancid oil has returned to his stall, wiser for the humiliation. Rome has corrected itself once more, oddly, gently, but thoroughly. And you, dear listener, have floated through it all. Not as judge or jury or goat handler, but as witness. You've felt the warmth of a sunlit trial, the sting of a public rhyme, and the soft absurdity of a world where punishment could taste like radishes. You glide now through the open wooden doors of a spacious Roman villa, its walls decorated with frescoes of swirling sea creatures and vineyard scenes. It's mid-morning warm, not yet hot, and the stone floors still hold the cool breath of night. You're in the atrium, the central heart of the home, where marble basins shimmer under dappled light falling from the compluvium above. Here gossip hums as softly and constantly as the trickle of water in the household fountain. Two female slaves, both young, both sharp-eyed, are sweeping the edges of the mosaic floor with bundled reed brooms. Their movements are slow, deliberate. They pause now and then, not from fatigue, but from the need to lean in and whisper. You catch fragments, names, suspicion. Something about a broken perfume bottle and the night the master returned, smelling of cinnamon that wasn't from his wife's chamber. The sort of murmurs that seem harmless until they're not. In ancient Rome, gossip was a volatile currency. It could elevate or destroy reputations, influence legal trials, and even make its way into written history. But among the enslaved gossip was also resistance, an invisible network of commentary and observation, whispered from atrium to kitchen to garden. These two women whisper not just to share news, but to affirm their shared knowledge, their place in the shadows of power. Yet they speak carefully, because to be caught gossiping, especially about the domus's most private affairs, was a risk with consequences. The paterfamilias might hear, or worse, the materfamilias who ran the house with a gaze as sharp as any magistrate's. And so they keep their voices low, but not low enough. From behind a doorway emerges the overseer, a lean man with graying temples and a walking stick he never actually uses for walking. He taps it once against the floor. The women freeze. Their hands tighten around their brooms like soldiers gripping spears. He doesn't raise his voice. He simply instructs one of them, Cassia, to fetch the tunica stultiferae, the fool's robe. A worn, oversized garment dyed in clashing stripes, designed for one purpose: humiliation. Cassia lowers her gaze, nods once, and disappears. This is not the first time such a punishment has occurred. Roman households, like miniature empires, had their own internal justice systems. And for slaves, these systems could be as intricate as the Senate's debates, or as absurd. You watch as Cassia returns draped now in the ridiculous tunic, its shoulders drooping, its sleeves dragging. She's instructed to wear it until the hour of evening meal, during which she must tend the garden, feed the geese, and sweep the courtyard paths, all while being pointed at, smirked at, and reminded of her transgression. It's not pain that teaches here, it's spectacle. Historians debate whether these punishments reflect cruelty or creativity, but for the Romans, dignity was a limited resource rationed out with care, and for the enslaved, it could be revoked with little cause. Yet within these punishments was often an odd sense of order. The same laws that allowed a master to punish a slave also held that unjust cruelty could be challenged, at least in theory. There are records of slaves testifying in court, of manumitted individuals suing their former masters for abuse. Still, for most justice came not from the courts, but from within the walls of the domus, where gossip could lead to garlands, tunics, or worse. You follow Cassia as she shuffles past the peristyle garden. There, another slave is being made to recite a list of kitchen inventory aloud while balancing a large amphora of water on his head. His error: eating a handful of honeyed dates that had been set aside for guests. The amphora isn't heavy, but the exercise is tedious. It's designed not to break bones, but pride. These internal punishments rarely left marks, but they etched memories. And sometimes, in the back rooms of villas, creativity flourished. One well-documented case involves a slave who had lied about the whereabouts of a stolen bracelet. His punishment: he was made to sit outside the villa gates with a painted wooden parrot on his shoulder, repeating the phrase, "I speak, but know nothing." This wasn't just a jest. Romans believed in symbolic justice, that the punishment should reflect the crime, not in violence, but in irony. A lying tongue becomes a useless one. A gossiping mouth is silenced not with chains, but with laughter. Cassia, meanwhile, finishes feeding the geese and heads toward the garden beds. Children of the house watch her from a balcony above, giggling. Her face is unreadable. Perhaps she's plotting to stay silent tomorrow. Perhaps she's wondering who told. You drift now to the servant quarters, tucked away behind the kitchen. Here, gossip takes a different form, careful coded. Slaves who've served in multiple households bring tales from one domus to another. Whispers become warnings. Don't eat the master's leftovers, he counts every fig. Or, the mistress listens through the walls when she claims to nap. You overhear a tale of a slave who had memorized every insult ever thrown at her, reciting them like a poet. Her mistress, upon hearing of this, didn't punish her. Instead, she made her perform it at dinner parties. Guests loved it. The slave became a curiosity, a living scroll of household drama. Was that punishment or promotion? Rome blurred the lines. Outside now, you float toward the public fountains where laundry is being rinsed on flat stones. Here, even freed women pass stories back and forth. Gossip doesn't stop with slaves. It's the very lifeblood of Roman society. You hear a whisper about a senator caught sneaking into a brothel disguised as a Thracian gladiator. Another about a patrician's son whose ears were pierced in secret, an act frowned upon as unmanly. These tales will ripple through Rome, changing subtly as they travel like water through aqueducts. You're reminded that in Rome, reputation was currency, and gossip was both its mint and its thief. One woman near the fountain tells of a friend who was accused falsely of stealing a hairpin. The punishment: her hair was braided into tight, elaborate knots and adorned with fish bones for a week. No violence. But every passerby knew the message this one steals. It's here you realize that Roman gossip wasn't always false. It was a mechanism, a way to enforce norms, to warn, to amuse, and sometimes to revolt. Even emperors weren't immune. Augustus reportedly had spies who listened at doors. Nero delighted in disguises and rumors, feeding his own mythology. Gossip in this empire was both shadow and mirror. Back in the villa, Cassia sheds the tunica stultifera. She folds it neatly and places it on a shelf. No tears, no fury, just silence. Her punishment is over. But the Whisper Network will remember. It always does. You retreat now, past the torch-lit colonnades, past the whispering reeds in the garden basin, past the mosaic floor where stories have been swept into dust. Tonight, you've wandered through a Rome where gossip carries weight, sometimes even more than law. You've seen how speech could be bound mocked or turned into comedy. And you've felt the strange justice of a world where words float like leaves caught between silence and spectacle. Step now into the dusky glow of a Roman taberna, one of many that line the bustling side streets just off the Forum. It's late afternoon. The wine has been flowing since noon, and the conversations are starting to slur into that hazy, half-drunken rhythm known so well to the back alleys of every great city. You ease between the rows of benches where tradesmen and scribes sit shoulder to shoulder, nursing cheap Falernian and nibbling olives that have long since lost their bite. In a corner, a man tells a joke about a senator's baldness. It isn't particularly clever, but the others erupt in laughter anyway. Some out of amusement, others out of habit, and one or two because laughter, like gossip, is the safest mask you can wear when tongues turn risky. Your attention, though, is on a quieter table. Two men lean in close, whispering not jokes, but stories. One tells of a baker who overcharged a soldier's wife for a loaf of barley bread. The other recounts how the baker was punished not by fine or jail, but by being made to eat nothing but barley himself for 3 days straight, supervised, and with a wreath of stale crusts around his neck. You blink. That sounds too silly to be real. But in Rome, you're learning silly and serious often shared a bench. Roman punishments, especially for petty crimes, weren't always about severity. Often, they were about fit. Not justice in the modern sense of proportion or fairness, but of poetic irony. The punishment had to fit the crime, yes, but it also had to say something, teach something, and ideally amuse the onlookers a little. This was the logic that ruled Roman streets, households, even temples. And the more you listen, the more examples float up like wine bubbles. There's the story of a man who spat in public, specifically on the floor of a bathhouse. Rather than pay a fine, he was sentenced to sweep the entire bathhouse barefoot, using his tunic as a mop. Or the young apprentice who botched a shipment of olive oil jars. The sentence, wearing broken jar shards around his neck on a string, and offering free massages in the public square, using, of course, olive oil. Even domestic servants were not exempt from such oddly specific punishments. One story half whispered in this very taberna tells of a kitchen slave who kept forgetting to add salt to the stew. His master ordered that for 1 week he was to add salt to everything he consumed, wine, water, even fruit. The result was predictable. The slave didn't forget the salt again. But more than that, everyone who heard the tale remembered the moral Rome in her own sleepy comedic way did not suffer fools gladly. You float now to the back of the taberna, where an elderly woman is embroidering quietly. She's seen a lot: servants run off, merchants, arrested, neighbors exiled. She speaks slowly, but her voice is firm. She tells you about a neighbor's daughter, caught faking an illness to get out of her weaving duties. A physician was called a family friend. He saw through the act instantly, of course. The girl's punishment: she was made to weave an entire tunic with the phrase, falsum est dolorem mentiri. To fake pain is a lie stitched into the hemline over and over. A punishment, yes, but also a masterpiece of passive-aggressive textile work. Roman logic in a nutshell. Now shift the scene again. You're in the home of a retired praetor, a man with a fondness for Stoic philosophy and boiled chickpeas. His grandson, maybe 7 or 8, has been caught stealing sweet buns from the kitchen. Not a crime of magnitude, but the man takes it seriously. Justice begins early, he believes. So instead of a scolding, he tells the boy to write down the full 12 tables of Roman law by hand with a stylus and wax tablet. 10 times. Is that punishment or education? In Rome, the line was blurry. Romans didn't just punish to hurt or scare. They punished to remind, to inscribe the cost of disorder into daily life. And often they did so with more creativity than cruelty. Even public punishments followed this logic. You now watch from the edge of the marketplace as a man walks in circles with a heavy wooden beam across his shoulders. His crime: falsifying measurements at his fruit stall. For 1 market day, he must carry the burden of dishonesty. The beam is labeled in ink, mensura falix false measure. It's uncomfortable, embarrassing, but effective. Customers remember, and so does he. And here's where it gets especially Roman. The public didn't just observe these punishments. They often participated in them, not by throwing stones or jeering, but by contributing their own barbed commentary. One woman heckles the dishonest vendor with a chant, "Your peaches lie like your scales." Another man jokes, "May Jupiter weigh your soul as you weigh your beans." The whole affair becomes something between a morality play and an afternoon stroll. A teaching moment with props. Of course, the logic wasn't always consistent. Some punishments made little sense even to Romans. You wander now into a dim legal archive where clay tablets and wax documents sit stacked like sleeping birds. Here, scribes mutter about cases they can't quite explain. One involves a man punished for wearing red shoes in a temple, red in that temple being a color reserved for gods and generals. He was ordered to walk the city barefoot for a month, carrying those shoes tied around his neck. Another tells of a woman fined not for theft, but for thinking about stealing her punishment, rooted not in evidence, but in dreams, reported by a priestess who claimed to see omens in her sleep. Historians still argue whether these stories reflect law or legend. You pass through the atrium of a magistrate's office, where a mosaic depicts a fox in chains surrounded by hens. It's meant as a cautionary tale. Deceit, even cunning, must be contained. There was a Roman belief that behavior was teachable, not through sermons, but through story and symbol. Justice wasn't abstract. It was lived, seen, laughed at, and remembered. A baker lashes a thieving rat to a bread cart as a warning to others. A servant caught mimicking his master is made to shadow him for a week, mimicking every word as he says it, turning mockery into a farce. These scenes pile up like amphorae, ridiculous, yes, but layered with meaning. And still, you float onward. You pass a school where children chant Latin proverbs. One sticks in your ears, poenae leves, memoriae graves, light punishments, heavy memories. You wonder if that's what this is all about. Not pain, but permanence. Rome, ever theatrical, understood that drama stays with you longer than bruises. A goat in radish garlands, a boy with a vinegar-soaked toga, a woman weaving her own lie into cloth. These are punishments that echo. You settle now under an archway, watching the shadows lengthen across the forum. The breeze smells of thyme and charcoal. A dog barks somewhere. The city winds down. You've seen the logic of Rome's gentler justice, a world where punishment doesn't break, it binds, where discipline is half symbol, half joke, where the weight of an error is carried not in chains, but in carrots, cloth, and commentary. This, then, is the Rome you've wandered, absurd but precise, stern but clever, a city where mistakes are remembered not for the hurt they caused, but for the tales they spawned. Dawn again in Rome. The rooftops blush under the first light, and the pigeons begin their unremarkable gossip on the lintels of temples. You, as always, are drifting silent, invisible, and wide-eyed into a house already brimming with tiny disasters. But today, your focus is not on the two-legged residents. This morning, you're here for a parrot. Yes, a parrot. Bright-plumed, sharp-beaked, and chatty in all the worst ways. It sits in a gilded bronze cage, suspended from an olive wood beam in the triclinium, the formal dining room. The cage swings gently, and the bird sings cheerfully into the silence. Caesar stultus est. Caesar stultus est. Caesar is a fool. Caesar is a fool. You freeze. Someone gasps. Someone drops a spoon. The parrot, unaware of the ripple it has caused, fluffs its feathers proudly and repeats the phrase with even more gusto. Somewhere in the back of the house, a slave stifles a laugh. Another one does not. It's not that the emperor, whichever Caesar is reigning at the moment, is listening. It's that he could. And in Rome, saying such a thing, even through the beak of a bird, can carry dire implications. The household head, a portly equestrian, named Marcus Sulpicius storms in, red-faced. He stares at the bird, then at the gathered family, then at the terrified servant girl who's been feeding the creature soaked pine nuts and murmuring to it while cleaning. "You taught it this," he growls. The girl, barely 15, shakes her head, eyes wide, palms out. Perhaps she did. Perhaps she only repeated something she'd overheard, and the bird, with all the tact of a drunken senator, memorized it. Here begins the drama, and with it, the logic of yet another bizarre Roman punishment. In Rome, parrots, magpies, and mynas were more than pets. They were conversational curiosities, living novelties displayed at banquets and salons. Pliny the Elder devotes an entire section of natural history to talking birds, marveling at their wit, memory, and capacity to mimic human tones. But that mimicry could now and then become dangerous. There are scattered reports, hard to verify, but tantalizing, of parrots executed for treasonous phrases. One account tells of a bird who repeated the Republic lives during Augustus's reign. Another of a mynah bird that croaked Brutus was right near a senator's villa. Whether these tales were real or embellished by gossipy scribes, the implications were serious. Words mattered, and in Rome, speech was politics. So what happens to our parrot? The family council convenes. Not in court, not in the forum, but right here in the peristyle garden, beside the small statue of Minerva. The options are laid out. Option 1, cage, silence. Move the bird to the cellar for a week in darkness. Starve it of attention until it forgets its offensive script. Option 2, retrain. Surround it with more flattering phrases. Caesar is just victory to the empire. Sulpicius is handsome. Option 3, dispose of the bird entirely. Release it into the woods or gift it to a merchant sailing east far from Roman ears. The family debates. The parrot, meanwhile, says nothing. It chews at a fig and flutters its wings with an air of complete disinterest in its own potential demise. You hover above, amused and alarmed. Because in truth, Roman punishments for animals, especially talking ones, were rarely about the animals themselves. They were about appearances, symbolism, damage control. This case, while small, reflects a much deeper logic. Romans believed that disorder could begin anywhere, in a careless word, a wrongly timed sneeze, or the chatter of an ill-taught pet, and it was vital always to rebalance the scales before the disorder spread. So the decision is made. The bird will live, but only after it undergoes verbal purification. A scribe is summoned, a tutor in tow, and for the next several weeks, the parrot is trained in a new liturgy of safe phrases. Ave Caesar, long live Rome, salt is the soul of the earth, boring safe state approved. The girl, she is reassigned to the stables, not whipped, not sold, just moved, gently erased from the bird's immediate presence. Punishment, in this case, is relocation. And yet, despite the resolution, a subtle chill lingers in the air. Not from cruelty, but from the reminder that in Rome, words, all words, had weight. You move now to another house, this one belonging to a retired centurion with a love for exotic pets. He owns a talking magpie that greets guests with the phrase, "Don't steal the silver." It's meant as a joke, of course, but you hear the anxiety in it too. When guests arrive, they laugh, but they also touch the silverware more carefully. Even birds in this city are trained to uphold law and order. The magpie legend has it once said something ruder about a certain general's sweaty armpits, and for that, it spent a week confined in a basket under a fig tree, fed only watery barley. Symbolic penance. Another whisper of Rome's curious justice. Next, you drift into a scriptorium, where a scroll recounts the tale of a parrot owned by a former consul. The bird learned to mimic the man's wife so perfectly that it exposed her infidelities during a banquet, pure accident yet scandalous. The consul, furious but unsure how to proceed, consulted both a priest and a jurist. The verdict. The parrot was a vessel, not a villain. The wife, however, received a social sentence. She was forced to sponsor a public feast for widows, an ironic gesture that even Cicero might have found poetic. Here, Rome shows its true colors. Again, punishment that teaches, that shames gently, that tells a story, even as it enforces a rule. Historians still argue whether these animal tales are truth or satire. The sources are mixed, the records incomplete. But whether or not they occurred exactly as told, the ideas behind them were very real. Romans believed that words could change fate. That speech shaped reality, and that even a parrot, if left unchecked, could start a scandal. You pass through a market now, where a vendor whistles in perfect imitation of a senator's lisp. It earns him a few laughs, but also a warning glance from a passing clerk. Not all imitations are welcome. Nearby, a man sells small wooden cages with painted birds inside, gifts for children. One boy asks if the bird talks. Only if you do, the vendor replies. A cryptic answer, perhaps, or a warning. Back in the Sulpicius house, the parrot eventually retires its Caesar insult. It learns to recite a poem instead, harmless, lyrical, and far less interesting. The cage still swings. Guests still chuckle. But the thrill has faded, and so you float onward. You've watched as a simple active bird, repeating a phrase, spiraled into a household crisis. You've seen the fear, the calculation, the carefully staged resolution. You've seen how Rome didn't always punish harshly, but always responded. Nothing was ignored. Nothing was too small. Not even a parrot with an unfortunate sense of humor. This, too, was Roman justice, theatrical, layered, symbol-laden. A justice where animals could stand trial, and a single word could be a crime. And now the sun is rising fully over the city. The birds chirp, but none of them repeat the phrase. Not anymore. You leave behind the cage, the girl, the scribe, the whisper, and carry with you a small strange truth in Rome. Even parrots had to watch their tongues. The sun is now high over the Roman skyline, casting angular shadows across rows of marble columns and rust-red rooftops. You find yourself swept into the noisy center of it all, the Forum Romanum, the beating heart of the city. But today, amid the hawkers, orators, and pickpockets, there's a different kind of performance underway. You spot him immediately, a grown man barefoot and wearing nothing but a tunic far too small for him. Draped over his shoulder is a string of dried fish, not fresh, not even edible. The smell reaches you before anything else, a pungent bouquet of salt rot and civic shame. He's surrounded by a small crowd, children, market wives, even a few guards. A hired flute player trails behind him, playing slightly off-key. A boy follows with a sign. He lied about the catch. You pause, and then it clicks. This man is a fishmonger, or rather was. He was caught selling yesterday's haul as fresh catch of the day, and his punishment, not jail, not a fine, but this a parody parade, humiliation in motion. In Rome, public shame was more than a consequence, it was an art form. And today, you're front row to the performance. As he stumbles forward, the crowd begins a chant. It's not cruel exactly, more like a sing-song nursery rhyme. Something like, rotten fish, rotten tail, smells like justice in the sale. The man keeps walking red-faced, but says nothing. He's expected not to. That's part of it. You watch as he's led past the fish stalls where he once worked. His old rivals smirk. A few customers pretend to sniff the air dramatically. It's silly, petty, strangely elegant. This is the Roman custom of infamia, ridicula, ridiculous dishonor. A category of informal punishment designed not to physically harm, but to imprint memory. It was rooted in satire, in theater, and in the Roman obsession with reputation. And it happened more often than you might think. You drift now to another square, where a donkey stands harnessed to a small cart. Sitting in the cart, holding the reins as if it were a chariot, is a man dressed in women's clothing. He waves awkwardly at the passers-by. The donkey snorts. Another performance. A whisper explains this man was a moneylender who mocked a widow for her debts. So, his punishment was to ride through town, dressed like her, with a donkey, pulling him, a beast associated more with stubborn farmhands than with power or prestige. The choice of donkey is no accident. Romans believed deeply in symbols, and when they couldn't afford to imprison or execute someone because the crime was too minor or the person too important, they leaned on performance. Humiliation became the preferred currency. You think of Plautus, Rome's comedic playwright, who once wrote, "He who mocks shall be mocked thrice over, and by donkey, if need be." Hyperbole. Yes, but not far from daily practice. Public shame as punishment worked because it was sticky. A fine could be forgotten. A whipping might fade. But a parade through the forum dressed as a foolish widow or trailing a cart of bad fish, that story stayed with you. It followed you like a bad toga stain. Historians still debate how widespread these punishments were. Some say they were common among plebeians and tradesmen, rare among elites. Others argue they were universal because no one in Rome, not even a senator, was truly immune to mockery. Cicero himself was skewered in public mime shows. Nero, before turning unhinged, was known to laugh at street performances, poking fun at his haircut. Rome, despite all its hierarchies, was a city that loved watching its own trip over their sandals. You follow the fishmonger a little longer. At the temple of Castor and Pollux, he stops. Two magistrates wait. They nod solemnly. The flute player falls silent. A small basin of perfumed water is offered to the man. He washes his hands and face, cleansing literally and symbolically. Then he's allowed to remove the fish garland. The magistrate claps once and the crowd disperses. Punishment over. The scent, however, lingers. You pause in the aftermath. Around you, vendors resume their calls. Children play with pebbles. A priest waves a bundle of herbs near a statue. All is back to normal. But the man's face, you'll remember it. That precise blend of discomfort and relief. As if he's survived not just justice, but a particularly judgmental comedy club. You drift now toward the Sabura, the working class district, where noise smells and scandal collide. And once again, you find a crowd. This time, it's a young woman, not dressed strangely, not crying, but standing very still in front of a painted wall. She has been ordered to remain there for one full day, unmoving while people walk by, her crime drawing graffiti of her rival's hairstyle on that very wall, adding a few choice words below it. The punishment, too, is symbolic. She is now the art motionless watched occasionally pointed at, a living mural of her own misjudgment. Someone offers her bread. She declines. The silence is part of the sentence. You begin to see the pattern. Rome didn't just punish with whips and stocks. It punished with irony, with theater, with a taste for the poetic. Every penalty was a performance, and every performance a reminder. Reputation was fragile, and Rome never forgot a good story. Even in the courts, theatricality reigned. Defendants might be required to reenact their crime for the jury, whether that meant faking the pickpocket move in front of a judge or restaging a drunken argument outside the wine shop. One recorded case involves a man who had insulted a Vestal virgin during a festival. Too minor a crime for exile, but too serious to ignore. His punishment: to recite a prayer to Vesta in front of her temple every morning for a month, dressed in a sackcloth tunic, holding a candle he wasn't allowed to light. He became a fixture of the city. Children called him the Cold Flame. He never made the same mistake again. You think, too, of the soldiers punished for minor insubordination, marching in full armor with sandbags instead of weapons, or tasked with delivering messages dressed as couriers, a role far beneath their dignity. Rome didn't always break you to fix you. Sometimes it just embarrassed you into compliance. A kind of civic ASMR, if you will, soft humiliation with enduring echoes. And through all of this, you sense a deeper thread control. Rome wasn't just keeping people in line, it was shaping its own narrative. Every punishment, every street theater of shame became part of the city's whispered lore, passed from lips to ears to scrolls. You pass a baker's stall now. A small sign hangs behind him. Yes, these loaves are weighed properly. Don't make me wear the pebble hat again. You smile. Somewhere a man is still walking circles with a placard. A boy wears sandals on the wrong feet, as a reminder not to mock his father's limp. A woman stitches linen by the temple, steps her punishment for swearing an oath falsely. It's endless and yet somehow gentle, laced with humor, anchored in metaphor. Rome's version of justice was less about bruises, more about memories. You step once more into the forum. The parades are over. The fish smell has faded. But the city is still watching, always watching. And so are you. The day moves on, and the shadows begin to stretch like cats across the paving stones of Rome. You find yourself pulled toward the edge of the forum where the chatter quiets and the real machinery of Roman justice hums quietly behind closed doors. It's here among scrolls and senators, jurists, and magistrates that the city's laws are shaped and bent. Today, you're seated invisibly, of course, in a small corner of the Basilica Julia. It's not a temple, despite the name, but a courthouse, a place where Rome's legal logic is both written in wax tablets and often scribbled in the margins of reality. Before you stands a pair of men arguing over what seems to be a very odd point whether a goat that knocked over a magistrate's inkpot constitutes a public nuisance or merely private inconvenience. One side cites a clause from the Lex Julia, another from the 12 Tables, Rome's oldest legal code. The scribe looks utterly exhausted. You can't blame him. And as you listen, it becomes abundantly clear. Roman laws were often specific, but never truly simple. You see, for all their fame, as administrators and record keepers, the Romans had a remarkable ability to create legal codes filled with blurry boundaries, vague definitions, and curious exceptions. It was both a strength and a weakness. A system built not just on statutes, but on interpretation. Take the concept of poeticule, for instance, literally penalty of the sack, a Roman tradition in which certain parricides, those who killed their fathers, were sewn into a leather sack, along with a rooster, a dog, a monkey, and a snake, and then thrown into a river. Dramatic, absolutely, but the details were hotly debated, even in ancient times. Which animals counted? Did it vary by region? What if you didn't have access to a monkey? Could you substitute a badger? Historians still argue whether poeticule was a consistently enforced punishment or more of a symbolic ritual recounted more in law books and moral essays than in actual practice. Yet the fact that such a penalty even existed says much about the Roman legal mindset. Justice wasn't just punishment, it was symbolism, and sometimes spectacle. But where did the state end and the household begin? That's another fuzzy boundary. You slip now into the atrium of a wealthy merchant's domus, where his steward is disciplining a slave for breaking a ceremonial bowl. Not valuable, not rare, just his. That's all that mattered. He doesn't summon the magistrates, doesn't quote the 12 Tables. He simply applies what Romans called dominium, his private authority, as head of household. And this is where things get strange, because within the Roman household, the paterfamilias had near absolute power. He could punish, pardon, reward, or sell. In some cases, even execute, though this right dwindled under the empire. It created a peculiar legal paradox. A man could be both subject to public law and sovereign within his own home. A baker might be fined for cheating a customer on the street, yet punish a servant for gossip in any way he saw fit behind his villa walls. You begin to understand the law in Rome was not a monolith. It was layered public and private, formal and informal, divine and domestic. Even animals existed in this liminal space. If a dog bit a guest, whose fault was it? The dogs, the masters, the guests for wearing perfume that smelled too much like roast duck. Roman law had opinions, but they were often flexible. You find yourself back in the basilica. Another case is underway. A man is suing his neighbor over a runaway peacock. Apparently, the bird had strutted through the plaintiff's herb garden, ruined a handful of lavender stalks, and insulted the dignity of a visiting aunt. The judge listens with all the gravity of a general in wartime. Why? Because in Rome, dignitas mattered. A bruised reputation could lead to loss of clients, fewer business deals, even political setbacks. And if that dignity was disrupted even by poultry, it could be considered a legal injury. You think back to the parrot from earlier, the graffiti girl, the fishmonger, each a victim of punishment, but also of perception. Because in Rome, the boundary between legal infraction and social embarrassment was paper thin, and the law reflected this complexity. Consider the case of stolen bread. If a slave steals a loaf, the punishment might be flogging, or worse, a public display of contrition. But if a freedman steals the same bread, it's a court matter. And if a citizen, it might depend entirely on who baked the bread. Social rank status, civitatis, was the invisible thread that stitched Roman law together. Different laws for citizens, freedmen, foreigners, slaves. Not always in writing, but always in practice. Even time played tricks. Laws changed constantly, reinterpreted by new emperors, rewritten by new jurists. What was legal last year might become forbidden tomorrow. Rome wasn't a city of stone, it was a living organism. Its laws pulsed and shifted like veins beneath marble skin. You pass now through a scroll archive where a young clerk reads aloud excerpts from Ulpian, a legal scholar under the Severan dynasty. He's citing a case where a woman punished her servant by shaving only half his head, then sending him to market. Was this abuse? The court ruled no. It was symbolic correction, and therefore within her rights. But the debate didn't end there. Other jurists wrote rebuttals. Philosophers weighed in. Poets even made jokes about it. Rome was a city where everyone was a critic, and the law was the ultimate stage play. You drift back to the forum steps, watching a new case being posted on a wooden tablet near the rostra. A wine cellar accused of watering his barrels. Not a serious crime. But under a little-known clause in the Lex Vaconia, the punishment involves, wait for it being banned, from drinking his own wine for a full year. Enforceable maybe. Symbolic entirely. These kinds of poetic penalties were all over Roman legal life. They function not just as deterrents, but as public morality tales, and sometimes as excuses for pageantry. You remember now, a case discussed in hushed tones, a senator caught falsifying temple donations. Too powerful to jail, too visible to ignore. His punishment: he was made to serve as acolyte at the very temple he cheated, cleaning the altar stones each morning with a bucket of vinegar. Not jail, not exile, but visible, poetic, and deeply humiliating. A perfect example of what you've come to see as Rome's truest legal principle. Every punishment had to tell a story. The specifics of the law, often secondary. Whether it was a parrot speaking treason, a goat ruining ink, or a man walking in circles with rotten fish, Roman justice always aimed to communicate, to educate, to warn, and sometimes to entertain. And that's the final boundary you notice today between law and theater. In Rome, they were never truly separate. Every courtroom was a stage, every punishment a parable. You fade now from the basilica past the colonnades and fountains, past the sun-baked whispers of the crowd. Somewhere, another trial is starting. Somewhere, another goat is probably causing trouble. And in the scrolls and laughter and shameful stories passed from one forum bench to the next, Rome continues to define and blur its curious sense of justice. You drift now into the cooler spaces of a Roman domus, a shaded garden ivy trailing lazily over archways, the scent of rosemary in the air. It's quiet here, deceptively serene. But don't let the stillness fool you. In the lives of Rome's enslaved and subservient, the most consequential punishments often came not from law or public spectacle, but from a master's whims. In Rome, the paterfamilias wasn't just a father, he was a sovereign. Within the walls of his household, his word was law, his judgment final. To displease him, whether through misbehavior, mistake, or mere bad luck, meant bracing for justice that was often personal, unpredictable, and steeped in mood. You watch now, as a servant kneels in front of her mistress. She's done nothing grievous. She dropped a dish during lunch, splashing lentil stew across a guest's tunic. But today, the mistress is tired. Her husband is angry. The stew was expensive, and so punishment is swift. The servant is ordered to wear a wreath made of dried lentils and onions for the rest of the day, along with a sash bearing the phrase, "Let no stew escape me." It's embarrassing, certainly, but what's more painful is the randomness of it all. Herein lies a strange truth of Roman private justice. Its cruelty was often casual. It emerged not from intent to harm, but from a sense of ownership. Just as a man might scold a dog or rearrange a garden, so too could he correct the humans he legally possessed. You find another example. An older male steward tasked with overseeing wine deliveries. A shipment arrives spoiled. Not his fault yet. The master, displeased, has him sit by the vat for 2 days with a sign, "This wine lies, and so did I." Even educated slaves, doctors, tutors, scribes, were not exempt. One Greek tutor was once forced to teach grammar using only vegetables as examples. Cabbage is a noun. Boiled is an adjective, a punishment. Certainly, but one laced with satire. The power to punish in these cases was not bound by codified law, but by social expectations, superstition, and emotion. And it didn't always follow a logic others could predict. One servant might be whipped for losing a comb. Another might be forgiven for breaking a vase. It all depended on the master's state of mind. Sometimes mercy crept in, too unexpected but deeply remembered. A tired slave is allowed to rest without punishment. A mistake is overlooked on a holiday. In such moments, the absence of punishment becomes a gift in itself. And as you drift through this garden, listening to the rustling leaves and quiet instructions, you begin to understand. In Rome, justice in the household was rarely about correction. It was about maintaining the illusion of control. And illusions, as we know, can be as fragile as they are powerful. The sun is beginning to mellow now, painting the city in amber light as you glide into one of Rome's countless storehouses, a horium stacked high with amphorae of oil, wine grain, and punishment. Yes, punishment. Because hidden between the goods are the curious instruments of discipline, some mundane, others surprisingly odd. You drift past wooden paddles, bundles of nettles, chains dyed with red pigment, and a cracked ceramic bowl used not for food, but for shame. Romans, for all their architecture and empire building, had a flair for inventing tools of consequence. Not necessarily torture, though such tools existed, but deterrence. Reminders. Things that made a person think twice the next time they forgot to bow to a statue or shorted someone on chickpeas. Here, you find one particularly strange object, a long olive wood rod with tiny bells attached to one end. It's a scandalum, a shame stick, not used to strike, but to announce. A slave caught sneaking food might be made to wear it around their neck, the bells jingling with every step, declaring their misdeed. Nearby lies a satchel of rough woven cloth, filled with, of all things, dried fish scales. These were occasionally sprinkled into a thief's tunic collar, or sandals, itchy, persistent, and hard to explain. A punishment that left no scar, but plenty of discomfort. You're beginning to see the logic. Romans preferred symbols. They wanted the punishment to echo not just through the body, but through memory, through social perception. Even smells were used. One merchant punished an apprentice by forcing him to carry a leaking amphora of spoiled garum on his back through the market square. The stench did more than any lecture could. And sound. A gossiping doorkeeper was once made to hum the same monotonous hymn for a full day, loud enough for all to hear, but never allowed to speak. Rome's arsenal of discipline was not just physical, it was theatrical, sensory, designed to leave no visible trace, and an unforgettable imprint. Night approaches, but before you retire, there's one more realm of Roman punishment to explore, one that treads delicately between law and superstition, ritual and fear. You're stepping now into a dimly lit temple courtyard where braziers crackle and the air hums with incense. This is where divine justice begins. In Rome, earthly law wasn't always enough. When humans failed to resolve disputes, or when the crime was too delicate, too personal, or too mysterious, Romans turned to the gods. Not out of desperation, but belief. In this city, divine punishment was a very real part of the judicial toolkit. You hover beside a young woman kneeling before a statue of Juno. Her tunic is dusted with ash. Her hands are bound in ceremonial ribbon. She's accused not in court, but by her own mother-in-law, of poisoning the household's water with unclean thoughts. Not actual poison, mind you, but bad luck, ill omens. 3 miscarriages in the family, 1 broken engagement, and a dog that refuses to eat. Superstition. Perhaps, but in Rome, superstition had structure. This wasn't just a scolding. It was a ritual accusation known as impietas, a charge of irreverence or offense against divine order. The punishment, not flogging or fines, instead, a week of temple service. The accused must sleep on a straw mat, cleanse statues with vinegar, and whisper prayers until her voice cracks. If she refuses, or if the priestess deems her unrepentant, she could be execrata, formally cursed, her name inscribed on a lead tablet, and buried in the temple floor. This, you realize, is justice by atmosphere. No gavel, no judge. Just ritual repetition and the weight of 1,000 eyes. You drift now to the Temple of Mars, where a young soldier stands barefoot before an altar. His offense: falling asleep during the guard duty. In a military court, he might be lashed. But here, among gods of war, a different logic rules. The priest explains Mars is not offended by sleep. He's offended by negligence. So the punishment is symbolic. The soldier must carry a spear dipped in cold ash through the streets for 3 days. It's heavy, not physically, but symbolically. The ash marks him. It tells the city, this man forgot Mars. Not every punishment was so formal. Some came in whispers. You recall the tale of the senator who defiled a sacred grove to build a private bathhouse. Weeks later, his daughter fell ill. His horses died. A fire claimed half his villa. Coincidence? Maybe. But in Rome, the public believed otherwise. His neighbors whispered of divine wrath of Numen disturbed. He was never charged. He was never forgiven. To avoid such fate, Romans developed rituals for repentance. A stolen loaf might be returned with honey. A broken statue foot was bound in linen like a real injury. A spoiled sacrifice could lead to weeks of fasting, not for health, but for harmony. You find yourself in a side chamber of the Temple of Vesta, now, where silence is sacred. A girl no older than 16 kneels beside a hearth. She's not a Vestal virgin, merely a servant who once mocked the fire gods while baking bread. She was overheard. Not punished exactly, but brought here. Her task to relight the hearth each morning for 10 days, reciting the same line. What warms us watches us, over and over. Her voice is hoarse. She doesn't laugh anymore. You begin to understand. In Rome, punishment wasn't always for crimes. Sometimes it was for imbalance, for forgetting the gods, for stepping out of rhythm with the unseen. Even elite citizens participated in divine correction. A noblewoman might sponsor a feast for the poor if accused of arrogance. A senator might walk barefoot to a temple if his political victory was seen as unjust. These were acts of public humility, gestures toward the divine that doubled as performances for the city. Some historians argue that these punishments weren't really punishments. They were traditions, ritual theater. But if you ask the girl scrubbing Juno's altar with salted water, or the man dragging a goat up Capitoline Hill in apology, they'd say otherwise, because these acts weren't optional. They were expected. They were demanded by both gods and gossip. You move now toward a dark alley behind a temple where a scroll seller is muttering a curse under his breath. He's writing it on a lead tablet, a defixio. It's not quite legal, but widely tolerated. He writes the name of a rival merchant, followed by words like, let his tongue fail, let his wine spoil, let his sandals break. He folds the tablet and slides it into a crack in the temple wall. Divine punishment outsourced to the shadows. Rome was full of these tablets. Thousands have been unearthed. Some cursed gamblers, others unfaithful lovers or cheating business partners. The intent was clear. When the courts were too slow or too clean, one could always ask the gods to play dirty. You pause beside a well where women throw offerings rings, hairpins, small coins. Not prayers of thanks, but appeasements. Insurance against misfortune. Every part of the city echoed with invisible negotiations. In Rome, the gods didn't live only in temples. They lived in ovens, fountains, thresholds. To disrespect one intentionally or otherwise was to invite their ire. And once you were marked, the only cure was ritual. One final scene before the night ends. A boy stands alone outside the Temple of Saturn, clutching a small wooden doll. His punishment, lying to his tutor. The tutor didn't tell the parents, didn't tell a magistrate. He told Saturn. Now the boy must offer his favorite toy to the god, asking for honesty in return. It's soft, sad, quiet, and in Rome, it's justice. You float away slowly, leaving behind the glowing altars and soft footfalls of penitence. You've seen lashes and laughter symbols and satire, but now you've seen the most ancient punishment of all, fear of the unseen. Rome, grand as it was, never forgot that every crack in the marble might be the gods watching. Midday strikes again in Rome, and today you find yourself trailing the strangest of parades. There's no music, no laureled generals, no flower petals raining from rooftops. Instead, a row of sullen figures winds through the streets like a slow moving each one adorned in some form of humiliation. And yet, all of it is sanctioned, organized, public. This is not a festival. This is punishment on parade. At the front of the procession walks a man dressed in a torn purple cloak. Not imperial purple. This is faded wine-stained cloth, dyed poorly and meant to mock rather than impress. A sign dangles from his neck that reads, "He lied about his lineage." Behind him, a woman carries a chamber pot, not her own, but one belonging to the household she once worked in. Her crime, breaking a favorite dish and blaming it on a cat. The cat, for the record, is also in attendance riding in a wicker basket lined with rose petals. You blink. Rome once again has outdone itself. These spectacles, sometimes called deductio poenalis punitive processions, were not everyday occurrences, but they were common enough to be remembered. They were halfway between justice and theater, a civic warning system wrapped in spectacle. The logic simple. Make the punishment public, and strange enough, and the memory will linger longer than bruises. And so the participants walk past fountains, bathhouses, bakeries, through Rome's open-air stage. The crowd murmurs. Some smirk, others shake their heads. No one intervenes. Everyone watches. At the rear of the line, a boy of about 13 shuffles along in sandals stuffed with barley. Every step crunches. A small sign on his back reads he stole from the god's pantry, which probably means the temple's bread supply. Or perhaps he took too many offerings from a festival shrine. Either way, the barley shoes will blister, and the blisters will preach. You float beside him, noting how his eyes stay low. But unlike others, he doesn't cry. Maybe he knows this won't last, or maybe he knows it will. Not far behind, another man pushes a wooden wheelbarrow filled with nothing but scrolls, copies of debt contracts he allegedly falsified. A soldier follows reading aloud. These are the promises he could not keep. It's poetic, cruel, perfectly Roman. Punishment parades could happen for all sorts of offenses, some petty, some political. One woman had to carry around an empty jug all day because she was caught watering down wine at her family's stall. Another wore a child's tunic to signify her infantile understanding of contracts. What made these parades so powerful wasn't just the creativity, it was the choreography. Each participant became a moving lesson. And every Roman watching, whether citizen, slave merchant, or senator, understood the law doesn't just punish, it performs. Some processions were short, just around the Forum Square. Others lasted hours, looping through neighborhoods to ensure maximum exposure. One anecdote tells of a man convicted of boasting false military valor. His sentence was to march in full armor for 3 days, stopping every hour to shout, "I fought no one but my pride." You can't help but admire the absurd elegance. But not all reactions were amused. You pass a stoic woman watching from her balcony. Her lips are pressed tight, her arms crossed. Perhaps she remembers when someone from her family walked the same route. Or perhaps she sees herself in the slow shuffle of shame below. Rome loved spectacle, yes, but it also remembered. Punishment parades carved stories into communal memory. And memory in this city was currency. Even the crowd plays a role. Watch now as two boys whisper rhymes about the scroll bearer. One starts clapping. A vendor offers a coin to the cat's owner asking to buy the honest feline. The absurd becomes folklore by lunchtime. Yet occasionally, sympathy breaks through. A baker tosses a heel of bread to the barley-shoed boy. A woman sets a stool beside her stall, gesturing silently for a man to rest his sore feet. These gestures don't cancel the punishment, but they soften its edges. Rome could be harsh, but never entirely heartless. You drift now to the magistrate's steps, where the procession ends. Each offender pauses. A clerk reads their sign aloud one last time. Then they're dismissed, free to go, if not exactly free. Their names may not be etched into stone, but the story will echo across dinner tables and bathhouse chatter for weeks. Some try to rebuild, others leave the city. A few, curiously, become minor celebrities. One juggler, who falsely claimed priesthood, later earned coin, reenacting his own shameful parade for tips. Another woman turned her jug duty into a business, selling water from sacred fountains, claiming it was blessed through her ordeal. Rome, ever entrepreneurial, even turned shame into spectacle for hire. Historians debate how widespread these processions were, but the records plays graffiti gossip show that they left a mark. They reinforced social order without resorting to brute force. They used laughter and embarrassment as currency, and they reminded the city behavior wasn't just private, it was public, and Rome was always watching. You step away now, leaving behind the dispersing crowd and the faint smell of dust and vinegar. The sun casts long shadows down the Via Sacra. Somewhere, a man cleans barley from between his toes. A girl lets her cat out of its basket. And the story of today's parade begins to retell itself in whispers, in jokes, in warnings. Tomorrow, someone else might walk. But tonight, Rome sleeps its lessons echoed in sandal signs and the ever-watching eyes of its streets. As twilight descends over the eternal city, Rome begins to soften. The shouting in the marketplace fades. Lamps flicker to life in tiled courtyards, and the smells of evening meals, boiled lentils, roasted onions, garum, drift slowly into the alleys. But if you listen closely, something else fills the space between footsteps and clinking amphorae. Sound, smell, sensation. The city speaks not only through words and laws, but through atmosphere. And in the case of Roman punishment, these sensory cues were as deliberate as any scroll or edict. You're drifting now past a laundry courtyard where vinegar and lye sting the air. Two slaves scrubbed tunics against smooth stones, both wearing garlands of parsley around their necks. Not for festivity, this is a form of censure. The parsley masks the stench of embarrassment, their offense, gossiping about their master's limp and mimicking his walk. The punishment wasn't silence. It was repetition, performance, and a persistent leafy smell that followed them all day. Romans, you realize, understood the persuasive power of the senses. A sound could mark you. A smell could shame you. An uncomfortable texture could stay on your skin longer than a bruise. You drift next into a bakery where the air is warm and yeasty, but not pleasant. A foul aroma curls from the rear corner. There, a young man stands, arms outstretched like a scarecrow. Around his neck hangs a pouch of spoiled dates. His crime, eating the bakery's fruit rations without permission. The punishment: carry the smell all of his theft for a full day while working the ovens. Everyone around him knows exactly what he did. They don't need to ask. The scent does the talking. Smell in Roman justice was both reminder and sentence. In the temples, those accused of minor impieties were sometimes made to wear garlic paste on their hands, a visible, smelly token of offense. And if you committed a civic slight, let's say urinating in the wrong corner of a public bath, you might be required to clean it, using a sponge soaked in perfume. Not to be generous, but to be ironic. There was no anonymity in Rome. You carried your shame on your skin. And then there were the sounds. You find yourself now beside a communal latrine where a man mutters something rhythmic under his breath. He's not praying. He's punished. His task is to recite a short phrase. The sewers forgive not the liar 100 times before he's allowed to leave. It's not a religious phrase. It's not in any legal code. But it was assigned to him by a city magistrate after he was caught spreading falsehoods about water tax rates. The punishment wasn't silence. It was noise. Repetition. Boredom amplified into penance. In some districts, certain crimes required rhythmic speech. One baker's assistant, for instance, had to declare, "I weigh twice and never cheat," with each loaf for an entire week. Public lies were met with public truths, recited, sung, even chanted until the air itself remembered what you did. Children caught misbehaving in temple courtyards were sometimes made to rattle wooden sticks rhythmically while walking in circles, each click a tiny admission of error. In the baths, a whistling sound might follow a client who'd been shamed for poor hygiene assigned to him by staff, carried out by others as a kind of auditory branding. Even the absence of sound could be weaponized. You enter now a small courtyard where a young woman grinds herbs with silent precision. Around her neck hangs a slate tablet. Silence suits me best. Her punishment: interrupting a noblewoman during a poem recital. Now she works at silence, surrounded by others who've been told not to speak to her. A week of forced quiet. No words, no laughter, no exchange. It's a punishment that bruises nothing but leaves you hollow. In many Roman homes, an offending slave might be assigned tasks that produced constant mindless sound-scraping clay, grinding salt, rattling dried chickpeas in amphorae, not to hurt, but to occupy. the noise itself became the judgment. Everyone knew the louder the task, the deeper the shame. You begin to notice how Rome uses the senses like tools. A touch too rough, a smell too sour, a chant too long. It's as if the city doesn't just want you punished, it wants you to carry the memory in your skin, in your ears, in your sleep. Even the materials used in these punishments were sensory choices. Rough tunics woven from goat hair, cold metal collars that never warmed, ink brushed on hands that wouldn't wash off for days. Not designed to draw blood, designed to linger. Romans were engineers of memory. They didn't need you to bleed. They needed you to remember. You recall one tale of a servant who spilled wine on a guest's sandals. Her punishment: she was made to crush grapes barefoot in the courtyard all day, surrounded by laughing children. The juice stained her feet purple for 3 days. Another man who stank of onions during a dinner party was made to eat only bland porridge for a week and wear a necklace of garlic cloves as a deodorizing charm. The logic. Turn the offense into a sensory prison. You start to wonder how much of Rome's justice system existed outside its courtrooms. So much punishment was environmental, atmospheric, invisible, but inescapable. You pass now through a narrow alley between insulae, where a group of young men sit polishing stones. One of them wears a headband laced with dried rosemary. He was caught spitting on a statue. The herb is symbolic, meant to purify his breath, and aromatic enough to remind others to keep their mouths closed around sacred spaces. You hover above as night finally falls. The smells of the day mellow into ash and wet stone. The sounds soften to distant flute music and shuffling sandals, but the echoes of punishment persist. A dog barks at a man still trailing fish guts. A child giggles at a cousin forced to sing about his greed. Someone lights incense not to honor the gods, but to cover the shame of a neighbor's mistake. In Rome, punishment wasn't just spectacle. It was sensory architecture. And as you drift upward, away from the city's pulsing veins, you carry those echoes with you, those smells, those chants, those textures. Justice here is not just seen, it is felt. The night deepens, and with it, the quiet underbelly of Rome stirs. As respectable citizens begin to close their shutters and bank their lamps, others rise to ply their trades. Traders, tavern keepers, whisperers, and among them, a special breed of operator thrives the informant. You find yourself drifting into a cramped back room of a wine shop, just beyond the Circus Maximus. Here, amid overturned amphorae and the musty scent of vinegar and sweat deals, are struck not for olives or tunics, but for secrets. The man leaning across the low table has no toga, no badge. He's not a magistrate or scribe, yet he holds power. His job: to remember what others forget, to notice what others hope goes unseen. He's a delator, an informer, and tonight he's trading a name for denarii. This is another facet of Roman justice. Not courts, not parades, but the secret economy of punishment. A shadow system where guilt can be harvested and sold like grain. The delatories were technically legal. In fact, the Roman state often encouraged them, especially under emperors, who sought control through knowledge. But legality didn't mean respectability. These figures were both feared and despised whispers of their presence enough to send entire households into silence. You hover above the table and hear the man mutter, "He's been hiding salt under the grain sacks, selling it to the army at Triple. A petty crime, yes, but lucrative to report." The magistrate will fine the accused, confiscate his goods, and in all likelihood share a portion of the penalty with the informant. This is the real profit. Roman law often rewarded informants with a cut of the punishment, a slice of the fine, a fraction of the seized property. It wasn't just justice, it was incentive. And when money and punishment intertwine, things grow murky. In another corner of the city, a woman known only by the nickname Capra Goat operates a similar scheme. She supplies whispered accusations to temple officials, particularly those involving impiety or sacrilege. A neighbor who skipped a festival reported. A cousin who let his fire altar go cold documented. Capra doesn't need proof, only suspicion. And in religious matters, suspicion can be enough. Sometimes she's paid in coin, sometimes in favors access to fresher water or protection from neighborhood patrols. Always she profits, and always someone else pays. You float now to a dim courtyard where a young boy stands barefoot, facing a wall, a wreath of fig leaves around his neck. His offense, talking back to a city clerk. His exposure, a fellow servant promised an extra fig tart at dinner for the betrayal. Even children learn early that accusations carry currency. This economy isn't always formal. It doesn't have ledgers or stamps, but it pulses beneath Rome's justice system, like groundwater beneath the city's aqueducts, unseen but sustaining. At times, the informants are household slaves. With ears in every room and nothing to lose, they become valuable assets, especially in elite homes. One slave historians recount overheard a plot between two guests to sell fake scrolls to a visiting dignitary. He reported it to the master and was rewarded with a tunic, shoes, and a small gold ring. A fortune by his standards. Other times, the informant is a jilted lover, a disgruntled apprentice, or a rival merchant. Motives vary: greed, spite, ambition. But the result is the same: one person falls, another rises. Rome, for all its grandeur, runs on these little betrayals. You pass a wall etched with graffiti, whisper and rise, speak and fall. A saying, perhaps, or a warning. Not all informants remain anonymous. Some grow famous or infamous. One delator named Lucius gained such notoriety that vendors began selling clay figurines of him with mouths wide open and coin slots at the back. Children played games pretending to denounce their friends. Lucius, ironically, was eventually accused of false testimony. His punishment: a silent vigil tongue bound in linen for a week. Poetic, yes, but it didn't slow the machine. New informants emerged, new names, whispered, new coin flowed. Even public punishments could have informants behind them. The man with the barley in his sandals. He was likely named by a fellow altar boy. The fishmonger with the garland of rot. His rival across the market filed the complaint. In a system where reputation is everything, an accusation can be more damaging than proof. You begin to wonder how many parades, how many signs, and shame songs were the result not of law, but of a quiet transaction behind closed shutters. This is the secret Rome legal in form, but fueled by performance profit and positioning. Still, it wasn't without risk. Informants could be wrong. They could be exposed. And when they were, punishment was swift. You recall a case from the Forum archives. A man accused his neighbor of hoarding rainwater in an illegal cistern. The neighbor proved the water was runoff from a shared gutter. The informant. He was made to drink nothing but warm salt water for a week, while stationed near the communal well with a placard reading, "False thirst, false claim." Rome punished its liars too, just as creatively. Even the gods had informants, if you believe the stories. Priestesses reportedly listened at night for dreams and murmurs, divine whispers pointing to hidden sins. Temple augurs read the flight of birds and reported to magistrates. Whether they truly saw omens or merely mirrored the gossip they overheard, no one knows. But their words carried weight. And when divinity and accusation merged, the consequences became irreversible. You leave the wine shop now. Its shadows deeper than before. The man at the table is counting coins. The accused merchant somewhere across the city is waking up to discover his stall's closed and his name on a board. There's no trial, no chance to argue. The report has already moved. You float higher above rooftops and fig trees and think about all the other informants at work tonight. The cooks, the guards, the errand boys, all listening, all weighing their words. Because in Rome, punishment wasn't just about crime. It was about who noticed and what they stood to gain by saying so. And sometimes the sharpest knife in the city wasn't made of bronze. It was a whisper. The night air in Rome is cooling now, softening the sharp smells of cooked lentils and alley dust, calming the hum of conversation under candlelit balconies. But tonight, something unusual rustles in the quiet, a disturbance, a story unfolding in the spaces where law begins to lose its grip. You follow the faint sound of hurried footsteps through the Vicus Patricius, a narrow back street winding through low-lying insulae. It's not a citizen, or a patrician, or even a street thief. It's a goat. Or rather, it was a goat. Tonight, it is a fugitive. There's shouting. Someone screams. She's loose again. A blur of white fur dodges between terracotta pots and laundry lines. She leaps over a stack of amphorae and disappears behind a cart. And trailing behind her not far is a boy barefoot and panting, carrying a rope, muttering curses in Latin between wheezes. This is more than a barnyard mishap. It's a ripple in the order of things. That goat had been sentenced just this morning, paraded through the marketplace wearing a tag that read, 8 sacred figs unrepentant. Now she's not where she's supposed to be. And in Rome, things not being where they're supposed to be is a kind of chaos. You watch as the goat vanishes into a gap behind a bakery, the boy trailing close behind, and behind him, an older man, clearly the owner, shaking his head in defeat and barking at nearby vendors to keep watch. The goat somehow has become the center of a localized panic. But here's the stranger truth. This isn't the first time, nor will it be the last. You begin to recall other stories. A slave girl who ran off mid-punishment before she could serve her public stew fast for breaking a wine jug. A baker's apprentice who refused his humiliation march, vanished into the hills, and returned 2 years later as the city's most famous honey seller. Even a magistrate's own nephew, once found guilty of mocking a vestal, skipped town and reappeared in Athens as a philosophy tutor. Flight, rebellion, escape, they weren't just reactions to punishment. They were responses to the theater of it, to the absurdity, to the performance that everyone knew was happening, yet still felt compelled to enforce. And Rome's response to double down on the theater. You float now into the Curia, the Senate house where debates sometimes touched on this chaos. One senator once proposed a decree that all paraded persons be marked with indelible ink on the shoulder or palm so they couldn't flee unnoticed. Another suggested attaching small bells to them like livestock. Some proposals were approved, others mocked. But the point was clear. Rome couldn't stand the collapse of order. Still, fugitives happened. All the time. Not always with dramatic chases. Sometimes, the escape was internal, a silent protest. A man assigned to wear a tunic, stitched with his misdeed, would flip it inside out and dare the forum to correct him. A woman, sentenced to chant her own offense in the temple courtyard, whispered it so softly that only the pigeons heard. Even goats, it turns out, resisted their roles. And when escape occurred, when someone rebelled against the order, it set off waves. You're now hovering in a bathhouse where a half-dozen men are chuckling about a servant girl who sprinted from her punishment line, tore off her shame sash, and shouted, "The figs weren't even ripe," before vanishing into the crowd. Laughter echoes. One man even toasts her bravery, not openly, just quietly among friends. It's a soft rebellion. Not a riot, not a movement, but a tiny crack in the marble. You drift into another courtyard, this one empty, where graffiti tells a similar story. Felix ran faster than shame. Better to fight Gurum than wear it. Don't parade me, I have sandals. They're scrawled in red pigment etched onto stone. Evidence that Rome's love of punishment had a mirror, a growing folklore of those who said no. And sometimes that no became dangerous. One slave, infamous now in records, only refused to wear the garlic wreath after being accused of spying on his master's guests. Instead, he wore flowers. He said they smelled better. He was flogged. But the image stuck. Years later, other servants in his district started to wear flower wreaths after minor punishments. Quiet protest, perhaps, or subtle mockery. In response, the local aedile outlawed flower wreaths altogether, except during Saturnalia, when everyone dressed absurdly and no one cared. Even the rebellion had rules. The logic of Roman punishment, so symbolic, so performative, invited symbolic resistance. And that in turn required more performance from the state, more spectacle, more decree. You pause now at a fountain where two children toss in coins. One wishes to become a senator. The other says she wants to be a runner, not an athlete, but someone fast enough never to wear the barley shoes. They laugh, but they're serious. Because in a city where justice walks the streets in sandals and fig leaf garlands, the idea of escape becomes mythic. You recall now a celebration years past where a goat did escape punishment entirely by jumping into a sacred pool, spooking a priest, and running off into the hills. The people laughed for days. A mosaic was even made, Capra Victrix, the victorious goat. It was installed in a tavern. Still there, they say. Rome remembers. It remembers its punishments, its humiliations, its spectacles. But it also remembers the ones who didn't quite play along. And tonight, somewhere in the shadows, the latest of those rebels, the goat from this morning, is chewing happily on a laurel branch in someone's courtyard, far from her shame sign, her rope, and the panic she left behind. The boy and the old man gave up the chase. They'll blame the moon, or the gods, or the breeze, and Rome, as always, will resume its rhythm. But beneath that rhythm, the cracks grow, laced with laughter, daring, and figs, sacred or not, never tasted so sweet. You drift now through a Rome exhaling at last. The frenzy of day has melted into a hush, and the golden lights that peek through shuttered windows are soft, drowsy things. The streets no longer pulse, they sigh. Your sandals make no sound as you pass familiar places. The forum, the fountains, the temples whose stones are still warm from the sun. Somewhere a dog barks once half-heartedly, then stops. And here at the edge of a quiet insula courtyard, you pause. You've walked the full circle, past the punished, the paraded, the ridiculed, the scented, the shamed. Past goats and garlands, parrots and whispers. Now, in the softened dark, you begin to see Rome more clearly, not as a brutal empire or a pitiless machine, but as a city full of tiny, absurd human attempts to create order in chaos. A punishment, after all, is a story. A message dressed in garlic or barley or fish guts. Something to remember, something to laugh about. And Rome, for all its marble and might, was deeply, wonderfully obsessed with stories. It told them through its laws, through its rituals, through the ways it chose to forgive or not. You pass a baker's stall now closed. The blackened sign that once mocked his underweight loaves has been wiped clean. Tomorrow, it may return, or not. Maybe his scales will be true. Maybe he'll wear the shame hat again. Rome's memory is long, but its forgiveness is sometimes surprising. In another alley, a dog with a ribbon still tied to its neck from some long-forgotten parade sleeps soundly on a clay step. You wonder what it did, or what it was blamed for. Because in this city, guilt and guiltlessness often blurred. A loud sneeze during a procession, a goat with too much fig mash, a girl who rolled her eyes at a statue, these could be enough to tip the scales. But even as Rome punished, it rarely destroyed. Instead, it repainted, retold, reframed. A man who carried a sack of spoiled lentils became a proverb. A runaway slave who returned became a kitchen legend. A boy in barley sandals inspired a street song, and tonight the city holds all of it. You make your way up a narrow path above the Subura. From here, the rooftops glow gently and the Tiber shimmers with the reflected tremble of oil lamps. This is the Rome that sleep remembers. Not the sharp clang of battle, but the strange murmur of justice wrapped in humor, irony, and fig leaves. You breathe in deeply, garlic ash, clay, wet moss, and you think maybe that goat will live to see another parade. Maybe not. Either way, the city will remember her, because in Rome, even punishment becomes story, and every story, no matter how absurd, finds its place among the stones.